Hello and welcome to this, our 96th live stream, Like a Goodwill Shop Exploded. This is, of course, a reference to our last teaching video, which was on the ad hominem fallacy. And if you haven't watched that yet, please go and check it out, because there's some colorful examples in there. So anyway, this is our weekly live stream where we take your questions on ancient Egypt and the Bible. And we got a few interesting questions tonight, so this should be very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to this. The rules are the same as always, which is super chats have priority. That should be no surprise to anyone on YouTube. But we also take non-super chat questions as well, and we generally run this stream for about 3 or 4 hours. If you are going to do a non-super chat question, we ask that you put a Q and a colon in front of your live chat so I can tell it's directed to me and not somebody else in the live stream. I also ask that you only post the question once. If we see that you've posted a question more than once, we won't take it, essentially. Just because that becomes too confusing for me to scroll through it and figure out where I am. The other thing we ask is if you're asking a question about the Bible or a foreign language, that you give us a little context. In the case of the Bible, give us the book it's in, the chapter and the verse. If it has to do with a foreign language, we ask that you tell me what language it's in and what you think it means, just so I have a little context to comment on. So anyway, let's start getting into the questions. And we have, starting tonight, with 5 non-super chats. Okay, our first question of the night is from Bonbon, who asks, which ancient Egyptian custom would you want to bring back today? Ooh, great question. There's a few that I think are very interesting, but you know what I think I'd like to bring back is the picnic with the dead. The Egyptians had this custom that once a year, they would go to their ancestral grave. And at that grave, that tomb, they would basically have a little picnic lunch. They would basically eat some food, have some drink, and talk with their ancestors. I think it's a fabulous tradition of memorializing. And there are people who in Egypt who still do this on occasion, which was go to the ancestral graves and basically pull out a picnic lunch. I think it's a great way to memorialize the dead. So it's a very interesting, it's very, very similar to All Saints' Day, except you're actually physically going to the cemetery to do it. So, and you're bringing a lunch. That's an important part of this. It's not just that you're going to memorialize the dead. You're actually going there and you're eating. Having a family meal with the deceased family is essentially what you're doing. So I think it's an awesome little ritual, custom, and I would actually love to see some form of that return. I think that would be fantastic.
Is Uncle George still bad jokes?
Well, I think the communication is one way, not two way. There, at least we hope it's one way. But so anyway, I hope that was an interesting question. Thank you very much for that question. Our next non-super chat here is also from Bonbon, and here she asks, how did commoners in ancient Egypt perceive corruption? Were they even aware of it? And if so, did it impact their faith in the pharaonic system? It didn't impact their faith in the pharaonic system. They were part of the corruption in the system. Okay? Corruption was everywhere in Egypt. It was completely systemic from your lowest commoner all the way up to the king himself. Corruption was rife in Egypt. And it would be until the first anti-corruption laws were enacted by Horemheb. So everybody participated in the system of corruption. If you were a commoner, and let's say you wanted your kid to have an apprenticeship, the way you did this is you got a donkey, you packed the donkey with goods, shoes, baskets, clothing, trinkets, wine, bread, salted meat, anything you could think of that would be of interest to the guy you're trying to bribe. So, apprenticeships in ancient Egypt weren't earned on merit. They were bought. A parent would buy an apprenticeship for their kid. So this is really, really common in Egypt, and it is completely systemic. So your typical commoner just thought this was part of the system. This is the way you did business, was you bribed your way through. And to some extent, Egypt is still like that today. You know, it's very, very common. If you want to go somewhere in Egypt off the beaten trail, you have to bribe someone to go there, to take you there. So that's not uncommon, even today. That's just the way the things work in Egypt. So, you know, this is normal. This is normal. People don't just do their jobs. They're often receive gratuities for doing you certain aspects of their job. So, very, very common. It's still practiced in Egypt today, but it was even more so back then. So, it really did not impact their faith in the pharaonic system. Among priests, what did impact their faith in the pharaonic system was more the loss of power by the king and the loss of status in Egypt itself. That was a much, much bigger impact that shook the institution of the king, much, much more so than the systemic corruption that was everywhere. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. I hope that helped you understand Egypt a bit better. Great quick question. Okay. Our third non-super chat here comes from Darkblade. And he asks, who do I blame for Amenhotep II being commonly associated with 1446 BC, which was before his ascension and birth? The guy you need to blame for this is a Scottish theologian by the name of James Orr. In 1906, he published a book called The Problem of the Old Testament. And it was a bestseller in North America. It was very critical of certain methods of higher scholarship, higher criticism, source criticism, documentary hypothesis. And because it was critical of these aspects, it received a very ready audience who was not quite prepared for the assault on, say, biblical authority that was posed by these liberal theories. But it also had this one new theory in it that proposed that the Exodus took place in 1446, roughly, and that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So, before James Orr, no one had ever heard of this theory. So, he's the guy you can blame. And again, the date of his publication was in 1906. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very, very much appreciated. Our next non-super chat here is from Gabriel Syme. And he asks, if you were a biblical minimalist, what discoveries in the last 50 years would be most likely to swing you to the maximalist side? Thanks for your work. Well, probably the big one in the last 50 years would have to be the discovery of the Tel Dan Stela. Now, we have to understand, 50 years ago, people were still doubting whether or not there was a King David. they were pretty much convinced that some sort of monarchy existed in Judah and in Israel, at least the divided monarchy. But no one was really, a lot of people were not convinced, especially with the rise of biblical minimalism in the 1970s, that there was a united monarchy, that there was a King David, and anything anything dating to Solomon or older was seen as more or less myth. Well, the Tel Dan Stela changed all that. It really did. It was sort of the turning point, and it was discovered in 1993. So it's at that point where the pendulum starts to swing the other direction. We start getting all this strong evidence for a Davidic united monarchy. And at that point, we now are no longer debating whether or not David existed. We're now more or less debating who was David? What was his scope? What was his influence? So this has been a dramatic change from he didn't exist at all to, well, did he have a small kingdom? Did he have a big kingdom? And or something in between. So what's the scope of the influence here? So I think that's the big discovery, the Tel Dan Stela. There have been, of course, a lot of other Stela, other things, but not in the last 50 years. That's probably the big one in the last 50 years. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. Okay, and our final non-super chat here is from A&E Nerd. And he asks, why are ancient Near Eastern grammars outside Hebrew Aramaic so high context? Great question. In regards to Akkadian and Alan's Egyptian aren't too bad. Oh, I hate Alan's textbook. I don't like it at all. But others are beasts. I need more hand-holding when I'm learning a language. Okay. In regards to Akkadian text is probably the preeminent, what we call reference grammar. Now, when it comes to learning languages, academics tend to break it down into two sort of categories. You've got, say, grammars that are just for teaching purposes. They're introductory grammars. They're supposed to get your feet wet. Collier and Manley's book on reading hieroglyphs is kind of one of those introductory books that's used to sort of get your feet wet in Egyptian. And I think that one's excellent. That one is really excellent. But it doesn't attempt to give you all the details either. You then get these big, comprehensive, complicated grammars that are very high context. But they serve a different purpose than, say, an introductory grammar. Those sort of big, comprehensive grammars are meant to be what's called reference grammars. They're supposed to include every little aspect of the language that you can go back later and look up, should you need to understand a fine point of the language. Hunegard's Akkadian grammar is actually a reference grammar. It's not really an introductory grammar. Alan's Egyptian is kind of somewhere in between. I just don't like his approach to teaching Egyptian. Gardner's grammar on Egyptian is a reference grammar. It's very dense, very packed, and it has all the little details you need for understanding every nuance of the language, at least as far as he understood it at his point in time. There's been some changes to how we understand Egyptian today, especially with the introduction of Polotsky's stuff. So, but those reference grammars are meant for people who are not just learning the grammar, but are sort of academics who are being taught by an instructor, who are sort of narrowing the exercises down so it's more manageable for the student. And then at the end of that course, the student has the grammar that if they want to continue learning more or looking up fine points, they've got that reference grammar that they can always look back upon. So there is a difference between a reference grammar and a as I say, an introductory grammar. So that's probably one of the reasons why you find that some grammars here are much more high context and less suitable for self-learning. So that's what I would say is, say, a reference grammar is less suitable for self-learning than, say, a reference grammar. So I would suggest that when you do learn a language, you start with an introductory grammar and then progress to the reference grammars. And you might find it's a lot easier to learn. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the question. It's a great question, because it can leave you very, very bewildered if you don't know the difference between the two. So it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. Okay. So we're now going to move on to the super chats. Okay. Yes, please. Okay, so our first super chat, and I just need to add a couple more here. Just give me a moment, because we had some last minute additions here. So I'm going to do this. Just give me a second here. I just need to update a couple of the images here. Got home kind of late from work tonight because my boss kept me in late, so the normal prep time that I would usually do to get all this set up ahead of time, I did not have the luxury to do. So just take me a moment here. And oh, there was also one other non-super chat I wanted to take too before we got into the super chats. Okay. It was at the beginning. I saw this earlier on and I wanted to take this. So I thought it was really a good question. Which is actually from, let me explain, Followers of the Shepherd. This is a non-super chat that was at the beginning of the stream here that I thought was actually really good too. This may be an impossible question to answer, but who is the first Egyptian? Well, that is an impossible answer. We don't know. And where did the term derive? That we can answer. We can answer where the term Egyptian comes from. It comes from actually the Greek gyptos. And gyptos is the Greek translation of Koptos. And Koptos is a city in Egypt. It's the city of the god Min. So it doesn't actually come from the word for Egyptian. Egypt does not come from the word for Egyptian. It comes from the word for Koptos. So we know that came with, say, Hellenistic, the Hellenism of Egypt by, say, the Greeks during the Alexandrian period, or the Ptolemaic period. So that's where the term Egypt comes from. It comes from Gyptos, which comes from Koptos, which is the city of Min. So that's where the term Egyptian comes from. Now, the Egyptians themselves refer to Egypt by a couple of terms. Kemet is probably the Black Land. They also called it Tawe, the two lands. In fact, Tawe is actually a more common term for Egypt than Kemet. So while there's a lot made of, say Kem and Kemet, the Egyptians more often call Egypt Tawe, the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. Thank you very much for the non-super chat. Oh boy. Face says giggle giggle. Min is great. Well, I'll let people look up the picture of Min for themselves. Okay, oops. All right. Let's get to the super chats here. Our first super chat here is from Ben J for $19.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he asks, do you take the creation of man and woman in Genesis 2, 7, and 22 as literal dust and rib, or more archetypal or figurative language? Well, that's going to be really, really difficult to answer, honestly. I don't have a position on this. My position on Genesis is it is mytho-history, okay? That it is using analogical language to explain some very, very complicated things. So there's going to be stuff like, it is possible that what the text is attempting to say is that Eve was formed out of something like a rib, flesh from flesh. And that would really, really fit with the analogical language that we do find in Genesis. We even see this in, say, Egyptian texts, where when it talks about, say, the flesh of someone, it talks about the rib. You know, this is a very, very common ideogram that's used in Egyptian. So it wouldn't surprise me if Moses is using a very, very similar concept as he's writing about, say, the creation of Adam and Eve. So there's analogical language being used here. So I think I would tend to shy away from a strict literal interpretation here. But it's also going to be more analogical and archetypal than maybe, say, figurative. So I'd also shy away from the other extreme, which says it's only figurative. There is something going on here that we cannot completely comprehend here because we don't have all the information. It could be literal. I mean, that's a possibility. It could be figurative. That's also a possibility but we just don't have the data. So I think a middle ground is probably more appropriate here, which is we know that the Israelites used analogical language in these narratives. So I think an analogical approach is much more respectful to the text and the original author's intent.
We do return to dust.
Well, we definitely do return to dust. That's for sure.
We return to literal dirt.
Yeah, we do return to literal dirt. So, you know, dust we were made, dust we will return. You know, that's, yeah. So I understand.
So there's a case for.
Yeah, so there's a case here for both sides. So with that said, that's where I would sort of lie on this issue, is that I think good middle ground analogical position here does the most justice to the text. And that's what I always want to do, is I want to respect the text in its original context. And with the author's intent most plainly in sight. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay, the next super chat here comes from Rurik for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. What are your thoughts on the claim that the law of Moses influenced later Greek philosophers such as Plato on their beliefs on God and the divine? Not so much Plato. And he's actually not a later Greek philosopher anyway. He's one of the more early ones. You do have the pre-Socratics, okay, and they're very early. But I don't by the time Plato arrives on the scene, the Septuagint has not been written yet. So I don't think that the law of Moses is going to play a huge effect in Plato's thinking. Now, when you get to the later poets, the late Hellenistic poets, oh yeah, there's definitely influence of the Septuagint. But, you're talking here 2nd, 3rd centuries BC or later. What was the name of it? There was a poet who did Carpe Diem. He was very, very influenced by the Septuagint. I can't remember just off the top of my head his name. Horace. Yeah. A guy with a Greek poet with an Egyptian name, influenced by the Septuagint. Go figure. Yes. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, Horace is actually is very, very influenced by the Septuagint. So, yeah. So yes, there's definitely Greek poets and maybe some later philosophers that are going to be influenced by the Septuagint and the Torah. But early philosophers like the pre-Socratics and even the Pythagorean school, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they're not going to be influenced because they come too late or too early. They're too early for any of that influence to take place because they just don't have the Hebrew texts in their own language. Once it does enter into their own language, oh yeah, all bets are off at that point. And we do have evidence of, say, the law of Moses being in Greek circulation by easily the 2nd century BC. So, Winnie, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Our next super chat here is from Kwame Adu007 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. What makes you certain that Terah of Urkesh is Terah, father of Abraham? Okay, several lines of evidence here. Okay. First of all, it's one heck of a coincidence that the name Teru and Terah are so similar. The other thing is that Terah is from Kashdim, okay, of the Chaldees. At least that's how it's been preserved. Kashdim. Well, Urkesh and Kashdim are incredibly close. The only difference is you've got that Dalet and Mem at the end of Kashdim. Now, is that scribal updating? Possibly. That's potentially scribal updating. It's also possible that there was a difference here in, say, in maybe orthography that changed. Like, for example, it could have been Urkesh Aram. The D could have, or the Resh could have been miswritten as a Dalet. And then you've got, say, Kashdim. Aleph may have dropped out. Who knows? Okay. So there is some linguistic, philological possibilities here that show that Urkesh and Kashdim are so close that they are probably the same thing. There's also the geographic factors of this as well, which is that Terah comes from Mesopotamia. Well, letter Woolly's Sumer, is not in Mesopotamia. It's outside of Mesopotamia. It's west of Mesopotamia. Whereas Urkesh is in northern Mesopotamia. The other thing, too, is there's a chronological factor here. Whereas Abraham is contemporary with Hammurabi, Terah is contemporary with Zimri Lim king of Mari. And this is in the early days of Hammurabi. So if you think about it chronologically, you would have Terah, Hammurabi, and Zimri Lim contemporary. And then after, say, the conquest of Zimri Lim, you have Abraham being contemporary with the later reign of Hammurabi. So you got that as well. You also got a parallel in biography. Whereas you have Terah, he's a potentate, he's a sort of a kingmaker in say, Urkesh. And he's basically trying to move his town to support the king of Mari. They don't want anything to do with that. They want to join the Elamites. So there's a rebellion. Terah's son gets killed, and he has to hightail it out of town. And he writes to the king of Mari and says to the king of Mari, I am now a Hapiru, a sojourner. And he goes to Syria. And in essence, he goes to Haran. Exactly like what we see in the biblical text for Terah. And that's where he's basically holds up. So it would be an incredible coincidence that you had two people, one from Urkesh, one from Urkeshtim. They leave their place under less than ideal circumstances. Both have a dead son. Both settle in Syria. At the right place at the right time. It would be an incredible coincidence if all of that was just, say, overlapping biographies. Now, it's possible, but I think that the possibilities here are so small that I pretty much think that we've got the guy here. So, that's what I think is going on here. Is that, I mean, we're not told why Terah, Abraham's father, left Ur. Okay? But at the same time, too, we also kind of figure in this that it wasn't under the best of circumstances. Because you just don't pick up a city and go sojourning for no good reason. So, I think there's really compelling evidence here to say that Terah of Urkesh is Terah, father of Abraham. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, the next super chat here is from Addison Weir, $4.99. And he wants me to make this statement. And I'm not gonna do it. Addison Weir wants me to say that I affirm, which I don't, American Yek, an early date Exodus, JPED, which would make me schizophrenic, stark raving mad, as well as Wellhausen formulated it, and the ancient astronaut theory hypothesis. Yeah, no, none of that. Now, interestingly enough, if you start teaching at various institutions of, say, Christian higher learning, each one of those institutions wants you to sign a doctrinal statement. This is one of those little dirty secrets of Christian higher education. Is each one of those institutions have their doctrinal statement that they're asking you to believe wholeheartedly without reservation. And you'll find that, if you move from school to school, you'll be asked to be a Calvinist, an Arminian, a Molinist, pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, a-trib, young earth creationist, theistic evolutionist, and you're being asked to wholeheartedly support diametrically opposite theological positions. And it's just like, This is one of the things I think needs to end in Christian higher education is the whole doctrinal statement thing. It was meant for a good purpose. It definitely was meant for a good purpose. And I think there's an idea here that, okay, the essentials of the Christian faith, okay, I can get behind a doctrinal statement for that. But when you start getting into these little minutiae that you do find in a lot of seminaries' doctrinal statements, you're asking your instructors to basically support wholeheartedly contradictory ideas. And you're going to get either dishonesty, people are just going to say, yeah, I'll sign anything, or you're going to get basically people who are going against their conscience. I think both are very bad. So while Addison, we're here is trying to yank my chain, I think there's something really, really serious here that's underneath the surface. Yeah, sorry to turn this chain yanking into a real issue, but I think this is a real issue, and I think this is something that American Christianity has to pay more attention to. Yeah.
The first level questions and give grace to the second.
Affirm the primaries of the faith, the primary doctrines of the faith, the essentials. Affirm the essentials, and then stays preferences, the secondaries. There's nothing wrong with a school saying, hey, we got these preferences, and we wish if you teach here, you don't have to believe the preferences, but we prefer you teach in this manner. I have no problem with that, if that's what they want to do. But when you start having people absolutely may sign a statement saying that they affirm every minor doctrine in your faith statement, there's then no room for conscience or for biblical exegesis or new information. And I think that's very, very problematic. And this is one of the reasons why I've had so much difficulty with theological colleges, because a lot of them hold to, say, the early Exodus date as an essential, or young earth creationism as an essential.
And what it actually does is it promotes biblical teachers. Why?
Yeah.
Because we know people who have gotten jobs and they don't hold it.
I don't have a position on the creation of the earth. I'm not a young earth creationist. I'm not an old earth creationist. I'm not a theistic evolutionist. I'm not an evolutionist. I'm not a creationist of any kind. I take no position on this. But when I get a doctrinal statement asking me to affirm a position, it sort of, raises the hair on the back of my neck. Just because I think it's really, really bad. And it creates problems. So, anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, our next super chat here is from right here. Aston Weir for $4.99. Another one. Oh, wait, hold it. We'll get into that. Exegetical Apologetics says, could be mug. Discern truth from what could be. I have tea in here tonight. Okay, that was fun. All right, oops, get that down. All right. And now he wants me to affirm another statement. My apparent love for the History Channel airs Ancient Aliens, the greatest show of all time. Or did I miss one here? Did I miss one? Yes, I did. Sorry, Addison. He wants me to declare that Patterns of Evidence, ABR, Answers in Genesis, and the History Channel to be the greatest scholarly sources of all time. Well, I'm not sure if I can do that. Because we have got a popcorn video coming up where we will feature best archaeologist ever. Ever. I'm going to leave it at that. Best archaeologist ever. And it's going to be March's popcorn review. So, looking forward to that. This should be really, really something. So, again, the popcorn keeps its secrets. We won't be confirming or denying any guesses, but we are going to be putting it up, the notification up there very, very soon for it. So, again, this is coming in March. So, we're in March already, but we're a couple weeks from now. So anyway, this will be very exciting. So I can't declare any one of these is necessarily going to be the greatest archaeologist ever. But these are all candidates. Patterns of evidence, definitely. ABR, most certainly. Answers in Genesis, could be. And the History Channel, well, we've already done the History Channel, so that's they could come up again. Who knows? Although the History Channel is very litigious, to be honest. Yeah, when we did the History Channel one, they came down on us like a ton. They copyright clamped down on us like a ton of bricks. They were not good to us. A lot of the stuff by History Channel is owned by A&E Entertainment, and they don't want anybody clipping any of their stuff without obtaining rights and paying them a lot of money. So that one is probably not going to be done again, just because getting past their copyright claim system is just really, really difficult. Really difficult. So we probably won't be doing another History Channel one just because of the mess that they made for us last time. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. He gives us a third super chat on a similar vein for $4.99. Thank you very much, super chat. Again, he wants me to express my deep, deep love when the History Channel airs Ancient Aliens, the greatest show of all time. Well, you know what? It has been pretty good for this channel, I will say that. Because Mr. Empty Conjecture was inspired by the History Channel. So if the History Channel and Ancient Aliens didn't exist, and Yorgos Tsoukalos didn't exist, we wouldn't have Mr. Empty Conjecture. So he's the guy from whom we got our inspiration for Mr. Empty Conjecture from. So, that the hair, the could be tagline, we got that from Tsoukalos. So, it was a great thing. It was a great addition to this channel, and created a phenomenon that's basically been a running joke on this channel. So, and we very, very much have loved that running joke. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And we got another one here from Aston Weir. Actually, a serious question this time for $4.99. Thank you much for the super chat. How do we know when literary parallels are the result of intertextuality rather than coincidence? Okay, that's a really, really difficult question to answer. Because you can actually have intertextuality take place subconsciously or unconsciously. Somebody may read something, forget what source it's from, and then engage it in a text or make reference to it in a text without citing the original source or copying it verbatim. So that is a form of intertextuality, even if it is something that is say subconscious or unconscious. And this is one of the problems when we try to untease intertextuality from coincidence. It's because many of, say, the underlying beliefs in a culture have, say, a common source, but it's not a common source that's basically passed directly but indirectly. This is called in, say, religious studies, the pool of ideas. Essentially, every culture has a pool of ideas. And religions are throwing ideas into the pool. They're also taking ideas out of the pool to incorporate into their own religion. And The Re-Enchantment of the West is the name of the book. What was his name now? Yeah. The Re-Enchantment of the West is the name of the book by a brilliant scholar. I can just look it up here and just give me a moment to look this one up. Christopher Partridge. Yeah, Christopher Partridge did a lot of work on this. And his books are excellent. Christopher Partridge's books are excellent. I would highly recommend them. But he talks about this pool of ideas where various religious groups are taking ideas in and out of the pool and adding their own ideas back in. And this has been true of all cultures going back to the beginning of time. So knowing that this is how ideas are being transmitted, it makes it very, very difficult then to determine what's a coincidence and what's intertextuality. This is why it's almost always more safe to claim intertextuality than coincidence, because all of these ideas just permeate a culture. And it's not an accident. It's not an accident. People are reading these various texts, and they're retelling these stories. And those stories become part of the pool of ideas. You know, it may have been originally, going back 10 generations, to a Sumerian source that nobody reads in the original language anymore, but they're still telling the tales 10 generations later. Well, if they're still telling the tales 10 generations later, those ideas are in the culture, even if the original text is no longer extant. So in that case, you still have intertextuality. It's just not direct to the original source. So with that said, it's impossible to tell if it's a coincidence or intertextuality, but it's better to bet on intertextuality, because at least then you say there's some cause for those ideas, which is that pool of ideas that was described by Christopher Partridge. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answered the question. Again, it's the safe bet. Intertextuality is always the safe bet. It's safer than saying it's coincidence. It's safer than saying it's copying. So again, it's the safe, scholarly safe choice here. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Now we're on to StreamYard here. Okay. Our next super chat here is from Angel WVM for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he asks, are the differences between 1 Kings 4:26 and 2 Chronicles 9:25 an example of 40 being used as a cultural idiom? Okay, let's pull up the text here, because these two texts are different in a way, in an important way. Okay, so we'll pull up our text here. 1 Kings 4 and 26. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Okay. Then we have 2 Chronicles 9 and 25. Now, Solomon had 40,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, here's what I'm going to say about these two passages. One of them has probably a textual emendation in it, or error. Copyist error is likely. We just don't know which one it is. Okay? The first king passage has 40,000 stalls. The second Chronicles passage has 4,000. Both have the same number of horsemen, which is 12,000. Okay? Now, do I think the 40 here is an idiom? It could have been written as an idiom. That's possible. Especially if what you're going to take out of this is, and there's also an interpretive matter too. Okay, so the 40,000, it seems like a very inflated number, especially for a small kingdom like Israel. So 40,000 would be over the top. Even 4,000 is a very, very sizable number for chariots. You would have the equivalent of 2,000 chariots here. Okay. Now, when you compare that to, say, the Egyptian army at its height, that probably had about 6,000 chariots under Ramses II. You're talking a lot of chariots here. Is it conceivable that Israel had 20,000 chariots? Probably not. 2,000 more reasonable. Yeah, 2,000 it could be, but it would still be a lot of expense and manpower to afford that. Now, the other interpretive matter about these two passages is we are talking about something in the thousands. That word Eleph, which we have talked about before on this channel, which can not just only mean thousand, but it also can mean, say, division, clan, contingent. So if you had, say, 40 divisions of chariots, yeah, or 12 divisions of horsemen, then that number becomes a lot more reasonable. So when we talk about this, we're going to have to sort of look at this. We can't be really sure which one is the right reading, whether it's the 40,000 or the 4,000, because we can't really be sure what's meant here according to by Eleph. So with that said, we have to be a little more open here to possibilities. There does seem to be a textual error. I mean, although you could even compatibilize this by saying, okay, you had 4 divisions, but say 40, or 40 divisions and 4,000 horses. I mean, that would be compatible, with each division having, say, 100 chariots. Okay, so you could make them compatible that way. I wouldn't recommend that. I think a scribal error is much more likely here than a compatibilism between the two verses. And there are scribal errors in these texts. So, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say. But with that said, I do think that there are, because we are uncertain whether it's the numerical 1,000 or a division of chariots, getting exact numbers here is always going to be dicey. I don't think that the 40 here is an idiom per se, although if an idiomatic reading is correct in, say, 1 Kings 1, if that's the original reading, then it is would be very idiomatic. I mean, that would be the quintessential, an unknown number of divisions of horses and, say, 12 divisions of horsemen. No, it's a possible reading on this. And 12 divisions of horsemen, wouldn't be unlikely either, because one from each tribe of Israel, there's you got a complete set of horsemen at that point. So it could be, it is possible that the 40 idiom is being used here. We can't exclude it. We can't exclude that as a possibility. At the same time, too, we also can't exclude the possibility of scribal error also, because we just don't have enough information to tell one way or the other. So this is a tough problem. There's no easy answers for this one. Thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that sort of at least helped to explain some of the issues between these two texts. Thank you very much for the super chat, and very much appreciated. Okay. Next one here is from Daniel Ray for $9.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. He says in 2 Kings 17:9, what were the secret things the people in Israel did against the Lord? Were there some secret rituals going on? Well, let's go to the text and find out. So, 2 Kings 17:9. All right. This is interesting. I like this question. I like this question a lot. This one's really interesting. And I'll start reading at verse 9, and I will read to verse 11. Oh, I'll go to 12 actually. And the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against the Lord their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. For they set for themselves sacred pillars and asherim on every high hill, under every green tree, and there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did, which the Lord had carried away to exile before them. And they did evil things, provoking the Lord. And they served idols, concerning which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. Okay. Now, secret things. Let's talk about secret things, because that is a religiously loaded word. Really loaded. Okay? When we look at, say, Egyptian ritual as a point of comparison, there is something called, in the Egyptian ritual, they call these the secret practices. If you go to Dendera Temple, there's a chamber underneath the temple that's elaborately decorated in alabaster. It's actually physically underneath the temple. It's called the Chamber of Secrets in Egyptian. And it's called the Chamber of Secrets because that's where the most secret, private rituals were done. And usually for, say, things like such as inauguration of idols and priests and all that. Okay? Yeah, I know. It sounds the Chamber of Secrets sounds very lot Harry Potterish. Okay, I get that. Okay. But it really was called that. So, but you had some priests who went by the names like the priest of the secrets. And these were priests that performed these private rituals. And they did it in darkness and in places nobody could see. Okay? So the idea of people doing these rituals before their idols was a common practice in the ancient Near East. Now, some texts will, especially when you get sort of more into Hellenistic times, they'll call these more mysteries than secrets. But in ancient times, like the Late Bronze Age, they're still calling them secrets. So what we have in the text here is they're doing these things in secret that are not right. against the Lord their God. And the whole context here is about religious practices. Verse 9, they built for themselves high places in all their towns. Now, a high place is aberrant Yahweh worship. A high place is where they've basically set a temple, not necessarily geographically high, but high in the sense of being elevated to a god. So it's not a high as an elevation, but it's let's say it's high in respect to approaching the divine. Yeah, a lot of people think they're literal high places, but they weren't. Okay. Any chapel could be a high place, but a high place is aberrant Yahweh worship. But it's what they did at those sites of Yahweh worship that sort of were detestable. Verse 10, and they set for themselves sacred pillars and Asherim, which are Asherah poles, on every high hill and under every green tree. So they're setting up Asherah poles all over the place. And they built incense on all those high places as the nations did, which the Lord carried away into exile. And they served idols. So what was happening in these high places was they were not just doing rituals to Yahweh. They were adding other stuff into other secret practices. They were setting up Asherah poles. They were burning incense. They were setting up idols, right? So, alongside Yahweh, they were also worshiping the idol of Baal or Resheph or whichever idol that struck their fancy. So, that was what's going on in this text, is they are practicing the secret religious rituals of these various cults alongside of Yahweh. That breaks the commandment, you shall have no other gods, literally in my face. So they are literally putting idols and Asherah right beside supposed worship of Yahweh. So that's why the Lord is coming out and saying, hey, this is not cool. You're doing these things against me because you know the commandments, you know the law, and you should know better. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And it's a very, very interesting question. All right, our next super chat here is from Billy Ningen for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good evening, Dr. Falk. Well, good evening, Billy. Tahom was said to have been derived from Tiamat by modern scholars. Yeah, many modern scholars still hold this. But could Tamtu, the deep in Babylon, be a better candidate? Thanks. I haven't looked up Tamtu. I don't see anything prima facie that would disregard it. It could be a better candidate. We do have certain things, say, things like Yom, the sea, being deified in, say, Canaanite literature. Or the storms, or that sort of things. There are these physical manifestations that are, say, personified and elevated to deity within these cultures. So I can't see any reason to discount this idea immediately. Now, I'd have to look it up in the Akkadian to see if the two are linguistically compatible. I haven't done that work, so I don't know for sure. But it is possible, and I wouldn't rule it out. So, but it would take going through, say, the CAD to figure out the etymology and see if the etymology actually works. But again, would not rule it out off the top of my head. I can't see any reason to rule it out immediately. And it is possible that it could be a better candidate. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Okay, the next super chat here is either from, I think, Oz or OS. I'm not sure which one it is here because you've got two capitals here. So for $10, thank you very much for the super chat. If you want to put into the live stream which way to pronounce this, would love this. Okay, because I want to make sure I get people's names right. And he asks, or she asks, what was the furthest away land the ancient Egyptians would have known about? Would they have known about Persia before being conquered? India, China, Europe, other than Greece? Okay. Greece, they knew very early. We do actually have evidence that there was trade going on between Greece and Egypt as early as Dynasty 11. While it doesn't appear, the names for Greece, like Keftiu, do not appear in Egyptian texts until the New Kingdom, we have trade goods from the Greek archipelago that, as I say, dates to the 11th dynasty. So, they knew Greece very early. Europe, yes. And particularly, we have evidence that they knew about what's it called? The Etruscans in Italy, because there are Etruscan craftsmen that worked on some of the objects of King Tut. Like, for example, there's a metal technique that's very, very particular to the Etruscans, which is granulation. Yeah, we saw the dagger, yes. King Tut has a very, very famous dagger that has granulation on the handle. Now, granulation is a really difficult metal technique to master. Really difficult. And the only ones... Okay, O and S. Okay, good. So, that granulation was only mastered by Etruscan craftsmen. We also have evidence that so they had some ties to Italy. So by the 18th dynasty, there was some ties to Italy. There's also some connection with Tarshish, which is actually Spain. On, say, the west coast, this is the coast that's actually on the Atlantic side, there were some Egyptian scarabs, New Kingdom scarabs, discovered there. So they do seem to have been aware of at least trade connections going all the way to Spain on that side. Okay? Now, with that said, okay, so that's sort of the northwestern extreme of what they would have had contact with, is Greece, Italy, and Spain. On, say, the south, the farthest they would have gotten is Punt. And that's in Sudan. Okay? That's in Sudan. So that's as far as they got southward, is Sudan. To the east, this is where things sort of get fuzzy. Okay? Were they aware of Mesopotamia? Absolutely. Absolutely, they were totally aware. They actually had diplomatic relations with Babylon and Assyria. So the Egyptians had diplomatic relations with both. They had diplomatic relations with Turkey. So the kings of the Amarna period were sending letters to Mesopotamia, to the kings of Mesopotamia. Kadesh and Enlil II was one of the kings that Akhenaten had diplomatic relationships with.
Interesting. They're a late Egyptian.
We don't know if there's a late Egyptian word for India. Now, we do know there were trade routes that went to India. How do we know this? Cloves have been found in the tomb of King Tut. So given that there's cloves found in the tomb of King Tut, they must have had some trade relationship with India. We also find silk that dates to the reign of Ramses III. So a couple dynasties later, Dynasty 20, we find silk. So for that, they would have gone to China. Now, were the Egyptians aware that their traders had gone to India or China? We don't know. But there is a trade route, at least, that connects Egypt to China. That's one of the things we were actually coming to understand now that we didn't understand before, let's say 50 years ago, is how extensive these trade routes have become. They're incredibly vast, incredibly extensive. And it could be that they're trading with one set of traders who trades with another set of traders who trades with another set of traders, and there might not be this, set number one might not be aware of where set number three is coming from, but they're meeting in the middle and they're trading their goods. Entirely possible. So, we don't know exactly how far the Egyptian concept of the world expanded. But we do know that they were aware that it was bigger out there. They were not that insular. They were not so insular that they didn't know that there was a big, vast world out there. They may not have appreciated how vast, but they knew it was big. And they did, as I say, have regular diplomatic relations with all the way to, as I say, to Mesopotamia, north into Turkey, and even south into Punt, into Sudan. So those were regular trips that the king would have been aware of. As I said, the one to Punt easily was, Queen Hatshepsut made a huge deal of that one. She decorated her temple at Deir el-Bakhri with reliefs of scenery from Punt. So these kings were aware of all these other kingdoms out there.
Her way of showing her travel pictures?
Yeah, she didn't go herself, but there were a lot of people out there who, yeah. So there was a lot of trading going on, and as I said, exchange of diplomatic courtesies. As I said, at least as far east as Babylon. So anyway, and Assyria. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat, OS. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Our next super chat here is for $5 from Billy Ningen. Thank you very much for the super chat. Dr. Falk, could the term matah, rod or staff, be of Egyptian origin? Madu? Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Could this be evidence for the early dating of the Exodus account? It's possible, yeah. That's yeah. It's a possible etymology. But there's a lot of these etymologies in, say, the Pentateuch. So, we've got like minerals like lapis that have Egyptian etymologies. We have also etymologies of stuff like baskets. The teb. That comes from an Egyptian word teba. There's the nataru. It comes in Hebrew comes from itaru, which is the river. Both words mean river. You have the suf, comes from the Egyptian word tuf. There's all these related etymologies that are derived from Egyptian loanwords. So the more that of these that sort of emerge, the more evidence there is for, say, at least a core account of the Exodus that's very, very early. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. And yeah, this is very possible. So again, we just keep looking at the text here, and we keep engaging that lexicography, and we see what it comes up with. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. The next super chat here is from Captain Seb for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. If the case for the Exodus is strong, then why do the vast majority of scholars agree that the Exodus did not happen as described in the Bible? Well, it's a great question, and there's several reasons for this. First is the whole idea that of scholarly tradition. For over 150 years, scholars have been taught that the Bible, at least the Pentateuch, was not written at the time of Moses. That it was something that was crafted much, much later than, say, the prophets. As Julian Wellhausen was most famous for saying, prophets before Pentateuch. So from Wellhausen's point of view, the Israelite prophets took place were writing before the Pentateuch was even formed. Now, this is very, very interesting considering that the prophets are constantly referring to the Exodus. So there's a little inconsistency there, but that never stopped a good theory from keeping its traction. So you got that. But you also have the idea that biblical minimalism basically says that, hey, all the stuff that's pre-Davidic is myth. The Judges is myth, Joshua's myth, Moses is myth. The other thing too is that you do have a lot of Sunday school exegesis. And that's a problem because when I talk to other scholars about, say, the Exodus, I usually have to correct the record of what the text actually says. And sometimes people ask me, well, what's the hardest piece of evidence you have to engage, which when it comes to debating the Exodus, and it's like, well, there isn't the hard piece of evidence I have to engage. Most of the time, what I have to engage is people have either misread, forgot the contents of the text, or have a inflated sense of what the text is actually representing. So in a sense, they're interpreting it through an eisegetical lens. And this is what I mean by Sunday school interpretation, Sunday school exegesis, is they've learned something, a rather distorted view of the Exodus in Sunday school, and now they're professionally interpreting the Pentateuch using that conception of the Exodus. And frankly too, the movies have not helped this. The movies that show the Exodus really affirm Sunday school exegesis. The whole idea of these 400-foot walls of water. Okay. I remember when I was driving in northern Nevada in the middle of winter. We had to go visit a lawyer in Truckee. And in the dead of winter, that was an experience. And the snowbanks were 20 feet tall. You got this winding little narrow highway with these 20-foot snowbanks, and you can't see around the corner of those snowbanks.
You were just praying people are not driving.
It was terrifying because you couldn't see around the corner. And all you saw beside you was these tall walls of snow, 20 feet tall. And they're like straight sides up. Look, I mean, if you've got a walls of water that are straight up, that are 400 feet tall, and you're driving a chariot in the middle of that, you are going to be scared out of your gourd. Okay? You're going to get deserters right there. Because that is a terrifying experience. No, it's not quite like that.
20 feet.
20 feet, yes. People will drive between walls that are 20 of water that are 20 to 40 feet tall. They will not drive through walls of water that are 400 feet tall. So the movies have not helped this any. Also, the fact that the wind would be impossible to divide water that to that extent is just, again, Sunday school exegesis plays fast and loose with the facts. So again, that's what I have to deal with most of the time, is that people have not read the text. They haven't read the text, they forgot the text, or they've got a image of what the text actually says that has no bearance on, say, what the text actually means. Again, Sunday school exegesis. So anyway, those are the reasons why a lot of scholars reject the Exodus. It comes down to academic tradition, it comes down to biblical minimalism, and it comes down to, for the most part, again, Sunday school exegesis. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, Nick Felstead for $10 Australian. Thank you very much for the super chat. In your opinion, how were stones precisely cut, engineered, and placed to form the Great Pyramid of Giza with the limited technology available at the time? Was it aliens? No. Interestingly enough, the Great Pyramid of Giza was not constructed alone. There is actually several satellite pyramids that were constructed at the same time as the Great Pyramid. These were the pyramids of the queens. One of those pyramids was unfinished. And very unfinished. All it had was the burial chamber hollowed out in the base rock, and one layer of stones around the edge. And what's really, really fascinating about that one layer of stones is they're completely unfinished. They had done the sides, but the surface was completely unfinished. So they basically started lining them up and making them fit, each one next to the other, and the outward facing surface was completely rough. So the way they sort of cut it was, they were using bronze tools. We have the marks and we have the metal, chips. We find bronze tools at all these quarries. So we know they use bronze tools. They use bronze saws. If you go to Giza, you can see the saw marks on the stones. Okay? So it wasn't aliens with laser beams, and it wasn't sound technology. It wasn't anything silly like this. They're using saws. They're using bronze saws. And as I said, we got more than enough examples of those tools to know that that's what they were using. They had chisels as well. So a combination of saws and chisels. And as I say, you can go to Giza today, and you can actually see the saw marks, on the stones. So yeah, there was no, it was sound foxes. No, it wasn't sound foxes. But yeah, they would actually lay these stones rough and then finish them later. So that was probably one of the most interesting things that I saw when I was at Egypt was on the Giza Plateau is how much of this was unfinished, and really it really was all that finishing was left to the end. They finished just enough of the stone to fit the next stone.
Were they covered?
No, they were not covered in plaster. The pyramids were not covered in plaster. Now, there is some suggestion. Basically, what they would do is they would put the rough stones first, and then they would put casing stones over them. And the casing stones were a fine kind of stone. So they could be either really, really white, fine limestone, but they could also be like red granite. Like the Pyramid of Menkaure was actually covered in red granite. So it was a different color altogether. Now, there's some suggestion that the Benben stone, which is the pyramid capstone, there's some suggestion that one or two of these Benben stones might have actually been covered in gold foil. But we do have examples of these Benben stones. And they're generally limestone. Occasionally they'll be black granite. They are often decorated. But there was also one record in Egypt that suggested that they were covered in gold foil too, or at least some of them were. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Next super chat here is from Faye of the Duat for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Inquiry in the chat, labeled with a Q. Okay. And she says, it is the 4th month of Peret, which is summer. Day 1. In the few days, it will be 4th of Peret 5, and the day of chewing onions for Bast. What is your favorite way to have onions? I am looking for ideas. Ooh, good question. Well, deep fried. Onion rings are always yummy. Okay. I like my onions fried. Okay. Onion rings. Oh yeah, they're good.
Salsa.
Oh yeah, you can use. I mean, if you can go this way too, you can always just say fry them and put them on a burger. I mean, just fried onions are just delightful on their own. I also like, say, spring onions. Say stuff like these they're green onions, and they're great on soups. Love them on soups. I used to chop up onions and stick them in ramen. Oh yeah, green onions in the ramen. Oh, so good, so yummo. I also like onions, chopped onions on, say, Irish potato soup. Now I'm getting hungry for stuff I shouldn't be eating. But another way I like my onions too is in, say, beef stroganoff, which is onions and mushrooms and a mustard sour cream sauce on beef. Also very, very yummy. Very, very yummy. But yeah, good, nice deep fried onion is a beautiful thing. Beautiful, beautiful thing. So that's sort of my onion repertoire here. Thank you very much for the super chat. There's a lot of great ways to have onions, and they're beautiful. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. I've got a $1 super chat here from Dien Salazar. Is there a okay.
BC put question right underneath.
Okay, let me go take a look here.
His first question was, who do you think is menace, and where do you think essentially how much did Egyptians just know about the Europeans?
Okay, I'm still looking for it here. Okay,
BC is right.
no, I do not. There they are. Okay. Right above it. Okay, I see it. Right, so here's Dean's question here, which is, who do you think is Menes, and where do you think it comes from? And essentially, how much did Egyptians during the Middle Ages know about ancient Egypt and Europeans themselves? Okay. Middle Ages, I think you're talking about, say, basically after the Roman Empire. I'll take that second question first, and then we'll talk about Menes. Egyptians knew very, very little about their history during the Middle Ages. In fact, knowledge of ancient Egypt just tanked domestically. As soon as you had, say, the Islamic occupation in the 7th century. With Islam, there was a forced language conversion from, say, reading the native Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic to Arabic. And this was forced. The only phase of the Egyptian language that really survived beyond, say, the Islamic invasion was Coptic. And because of Coptic being more of a dialect that was used in Christian areas in Egypt, the history and the religion of Egypt had not been preserved through Coptic writings. So by the time you get to, say, the Middle Ages, which are about 2 centuries after, the Egyptian people had forgotten how to read hieroglyphs. They had forgotten how to read demotic and hieratic, and they had no real knowledge of their history anymore. We actually have one text from, say, I think it's around 150 years after the Islamic conquest of Egypt, that attempts to read hieroglyphs, and they don't understand the language at that point. It's very, very clear that the author of this text did not understand the language. It's more akin to Joseph Smith's interpretation of hieroglyphs than it was to anything that you could call a language manual. It took a very symbolic method of reading hieroglyphs as opposed to a linguistic method. So it's clear that by around 500 AD, and frankly, this we can't just blame this on Islam. The language itself had fallen deeply, deeply out of favor by the 5th century AD. Okay? So it was already it was on the road to being a dead language by the time Islam had arrived. People in Egypt were speaking Greek. They were speaking Coptic. That's really what the people were speaking then. Egypt was essentially a Greek and Coptic speaking nation. Hieroglyphs were, as I say, on the way out already in the 5th century. It was just a matter of time. But Islam accelerated that process. So they actually had very, very little knowledge by the Middle Ages about any of their history, about any of their religion or background. So that's just sort of the consequences of invasion and declining popularity of their own culture. Now, the first question, who is Menes? Egyptologists debate this all the time. Menes is a name of one of the early kings of either Nagata 3 or Dynasty 1. And it's been nailed. It's pretty much, Egyptologists are divided between one of 2 kings. Now, we do find the name Menes extant. It is extant. But it doesn't seem to be a king in isolation. And it seems to be connected. We know that Menes was a unifier of Egypt. That much we know. But there's 2 candidates that could have possibly been Menes. So it seems to have been a second name for one of these 2 kings. Either the king Hor-Aha, which was a king in Nagata 3 period, which is the sort of the kind of Dynasty 0, the dynasty before Dynasty 1, or King Narmer. And Narmer was one of the first kings of Dynasty 1. Okay? So it's one of the 2 of those kings. So we don't know who it is. And Egyptologists, you can ask 100 Egyptologists and they'll be sort of divided 50-50 on this. So there's no consensus here. There's no consensus here whether it's Hor-Ah or Narmer. And I don't have an opinion on this, honestly. I could go either way on this. I think there's good evidence for both arguments. So we're just not sure. We're just not sure. And Egyptologists will go back and forth on this one. We don't have enough evidence, and I hope someday we do. So we do know Menes was a king. We do know Menes was the name of a king. Memphis is named after Menes. And we know it's either Hor-Aha or Narmer. And that's about all we know. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. And great question. Okay. Just a second here. Gotta check something here. Okay, our next one here is from Alonzo Muncy for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Question below, let's take a look. And he asks, what is the symbolic meaning of destroying high places, Asherah poles, etc., and what would be the equivalent in modern culture? Ooh, interesting. Part 2. Wow. Okay, well, symbolic meaning of destroying high places and Asherah poles. Now, high places are aberrant worship. All worship of Yahweh, at least where altars were set up, was supposed to be done at the temple in Jerusalem. That was the prescribed place for Yahweh worship. Now, later on, you have the synagogue movement that's going to worship God, but not in the same way as the high places. synagogue worship is going to be more along the lines of, say, study, praise, prayer, that sort of thing is going to happen in synagogues. But cultic ritual, incense worship, burnt sacrifices, incense, grain offerings, that has to be done through the temple in Jerusalem. So there is a difference in ritual practice that can only be done in say, the temple at Jerusalem. And what the high places tried to do was democratize that sort of sacrifice, and that was not permitted. So the destruction of the high places, the Asherah, was meant to curtail those practices so that the Orthodox Yahwehism could, say, be the dominant means of which sacrifice was done. So it's hard to say what would be the equivalent in modern culture. Because
Well, what if it be like universalism? Everybody worship God however.
well, yeah, universalism is a possibility here where you have everyone worshiping their own way. Open theism, maybe. Open theism is a possibility where everyone is sort of has their own ideas of God and their own forms of worship. That sort of thing could be a possibility here. It's hard to say because we don't have a national religion like Israel had. It didn't have a national religion. It did not have, say, prescribed methods of religion. So it would be very, very difficult to sort of derive a equivalent here because we're not a theocracy. Now, what you could do is you could make a sports analogy out of this. You could say the official football is the NFL, but every high school has its own league. every high school team has a football team. It'd be kind of like saying, well, you can't play football because you're not the NFL. Okay, so you could make a sports analogy here, but it would be an analogy at best. So I don't think it would be very, very difficult here to try to draw an analogy because the circumstances are so different.
I think it's the point that it's worshiping God in high places.
Yeah.
Worshiping God your own way.
Yeah, I mean, that's really...
We have that.
Yeah.
Millions of examples of the Christian Druids.
Well, how about this? Spirituality versus being religious. That's probably the closest modern religious equivalent to the high places, is those who claim to be spiritual but not religious. Who are basically, they don't go to church, but they're going to the seaside or taking a walk in the park. They're worshiping God their own way. Self-styled religion. That's what the high places represent, is self-styled religion. And we do have a lot of self-styled religion today.
And being good enough. I'm good enough, so God has to accept.
Yeah. And not just how, worship is done, but what we believe about God. The idea that we're good enough to get to heaven on our own, or we're just good people. There's a lot of self-styled religion that wants to paint God being a certain way that God himself does not purport himself to be.
And the basic one in this day and age, in a world of entitled people, that if there's a God, he owes me.
Yeah.
Him anything. If he exists, he owes me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's our biggest.
Yeah, there is an aspect of entitlement that is that people have when they do come to God, as my producer has just sort of pointed out here. So that does sort of frame this in probably the best way we can here, which is what we're talking about with high places is self-styled worship. And the destruction of those high places was to prevent self-styled worship. So anyway, I hope that answered your super chat. Thank you very much for the question. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, we have another one here from OS for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. I'm assuming that there is a question below. Let's see if I can find it. OS just gave a $5 super chat. I don't see a question yet. Not until the next one. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Very much appreciate this support of the channel, because without that support, we would have a very, very difficult time continuing to answer your questions on a weekly basis. We do very, very much appreciate all the support we get. It puts food on our table. It pays for our bills. So, you know, these contributions are very important to us, and we very, very much appreciate all this support that we get. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Oh. All right. Let's see here. The next super chat we have is another $1 super chat here from Dean Salazar. $1. Thank you very much for the super chat. And let me see if I can find a question attached to that. All right, we found a question here. And Dean asks, last one tonight. What are your thoughts on Katal Hatok and its potential interactions with the biblical world? Pre-flood, Tower and Babel, etc. I feel like it interacts somehow. Okay. Let me just do here. Just a quick look here. Katal Hayuk. Okay. All right, we're talking here. I mean, this is a little out of my league because we're talking here a large Neolithic, Chalcolithic settlement in Turkey. Now, I do have a friend who's very, very much into this. She's into Anatolian prehistory. So this would be more her field, to be very honest. But I think this is pre-Babel. I think this is it pre-flood? Hard to say. My gut feeling is it's post-flood, but I also think it's also pre-Babel. So I think it falls somewhere in that kind of range. Now, how exactly does that interact with, say, the biblical narrative is a difficult question. Because we're talking here about Anatolia, we are also talking about, say, the descendants of Japheth. If we take, say, the Table of Nations here, and say the descendants of Noah himself. So again, I'm thinking here that it's post-flood and pre-Babel. So, but I don't think there's a direct interaction here with the biblical text as well. And the biblical text does not try to interact with all these various nations either. And I think that's one of the things we have to keep in mind when we look at, say Genesis 10. Which is Genesis 10 is not trying to map out every nation and what happened to it. It's basically trying to give you a worldview from, say, the ancient Israelite perspective of how the nations sort of cover the earth. It's meant to be ethnographic, and in many respects, it does follow Israelite biases. Okay, so it's as much a political statement of, say, Israel's place in the universe as it is really an attempt to show the descendants of man. In fact, it's probably more a political document than it is, say, a genealogical document. So with that said, that's where I think it fits into, say, the milieu of world history, is it's post-flood and pre-Babel. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. It's an interesting question. I don't talk much about Anatolian archaeology. It's not really my, as I say, not my strong point. I don't do a lot on Anatolia. I've dabbled a bit on the Hittite stuff. That's because I have to frequently do Hittite stuff. But anything pre-Hittite is usually way outside of my wheelhouse. So with that said, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, we got another question here from OS for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he asks, in Genesis 39, where Joseph prospered in Potiphar's house, how would Joseph have been able to demonstrate his skills? Did Egyptians test their slaves? Would he have been bought with certain purpose in mind? Oh yeah, totally. Slaves in many ways were finished products. They were bought with certain skills in mind. Now, Joseph, being fairly young, could have been trained. So there was probably some training that Potiphar invested in Joseph. He was what was called an emirah in Egyptian. An emirah is the Egyptian word for overseer. And we're told in the text that Joseph found favor and was put over the household of Potiphar. So he would have probably had to have been relatively good at, say, accounting skills, reading, writing. And these were skills that many slaves did pick up in Egypt. They were trained in it, and they had to do it for their jobs. Even if, say, the head of the house didn't read, the overseer, the emirah, he had to. Just because he had to keep an account of the grain that was collected. How many reams of cloth were made. You know, these were common everyday accounting features that every overseer would have to do for a major household. And Potiphar, as captain of the royal guard, would have had a major household. So, absolutely, he would have definitely been at least educated. He would have had to have shown some aptitude in these things to have been selected for education. Would they have tested him? No. But what they would have done is given him tasks as a kid. Give him a task. See how he does. If he does well, give him better, bigger, and better tasks. I mean, this was common sense management, essentially. So yeah, absolutely. You know, there would have been at least every task he would have been given would have been a kind of test to show aptitude. Was he bought with a certain purpose in mind? Probably not. He was probably bought as a young child that could have been moldable, that could have been groomed to take on more responsibility. But, you know, people have, even back then, they bought young slaves, and they turned out to be duds. You know, dullards. There's a particular ostraga from Deir el-Medina. Basically, a message was sent to a stonecutter in the field, in probably in Kings Valley. They were working on tombs in Kings Valley at the time. And the message said, it was sent by a young boy, a courier, from the village to the worker. And the message said, the message was on the message was written, please put your reply in writing because the boy is an idiot. So, not every young lad in Egypt was prime material. Okay. Apparently that particular messenger had a reputation for messing up. So, what can you say? It's just like, okay, he's, you can't fault the kid that he's not the brightest bulb in the pack, but Joseph was, and Joseph was a bright lad, and Potiphar would have given him tasks, and he would have probably performed them well and given more tasks. So, with that in mind, he probably would have built for himself quite a reputation for his aptitude, his organizational skills, his ability to read, write, and to do basic accounting functions that were necessary as an overseer. And he would have taken those skills and basically used them for when he became vizier over Egypt. So that shows you the kind of aptitude he would have had, that he could take those transferable skills from managing a household to managing a country. So we can only infer from this that he was incredibly intelligent. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, another one from OS for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, I know you don't talk about denominations, but what is your advice to someone looking for a church? Thank you. Okay. Yes, I do have some advice for looking for a church. On this channel, we don't side with any one denomination. We leave that to the conscience of the viewer to choose whatever denomination. If you are looking for a church, and I'm going to stress here, a Christian church, okay? There are other kinds of churches out there, okay? Those have their own particular criteria. We're not going to cover those because I'm not going to tell you how to select a non-Christian church. But a Christian church, and the reason I'm not going to tell you how to select a non-Christian church is I have no expertise in that, okay? And we don't...
This is a Christian.
This is a Christian channel, so we're going to tell you how to do a Christian church, okay? So when you're selecting a church, I would say, okay, first thing is get their doctrinal statement. I mean, this is fascinating. This is a fascinating exercise all on its own. You visit a new church, I think the first thing you should ask for is their doctrinal statement. Some of them many of them will go, what's that? Huh? Doctrinal statement? What's that? I mean, we did this. We do this at every church we visit. Is we ask for the doctrinal statement. What do you believe? And it's amazing the responses you get. I had. There was one I asked, and I just let her sort of hang there for like.
Which church it is?
Okay, it was Willow Creek. It was Willow Creek. We visited Willow Creek, the big mega church in Illinois. Okay. I went there, and they had a visitor center, and so okay. I mean, that was a weird church anyway. It looked like you were walking through an airport. But I visited the visitor center, and I asked for the doctrinal statement. She goes, doctrinal statement? Doctrinal statement. She thinks, and thinks, and thinks, and like 20 seconds go by. I mean, she waits. She waits for a long time, and she goes, oh, what we believe. Okay, so get their doctrinal statement. Find out what they believe. It's fascinating, especially once you have been to several churches and you start looking at them side by side. You get very, very Yeah, exegetical apologetics doctrinal statement. What's that? Bye. Yeah. Wow. But you get them and you start looking at them side by side, and you see some very, very interesting things in doctrinal statements. Really interesting. You'll see there'll be like the essentials. Always look for the essentials. You know, like the Trinity is an essential. Salvation by grace through faith is an essential. The virgin birth is an essential. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ is an essential. Second coming of Jesus is an essential. You know, there are essentials of the Christian faith that any good church has to have. Okay? Then, once you get past, once a church gets past, say, a good analysis of the essentials, then you can look at their secondary doctrines. And then at that point, you have to ask, is this a good fit for me? Can I live with the secondary issues, the secondary beliefs? Now, it's going to come down to this, really. There's no perfect church. If you're well studied in the Bible, there's going to be something you disagree with in any church. Every church is going to have something you disagree with if you are a student of the Bible. Okay? If it's going to come down to, though, is this a place where you can have good community? Is the secondary issues going to be something you can live with? Is it someplace you can serve? That's a huge one. It's one that a lot of people go to churches thinking, what am I going to get out of this? It's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. The right question is, how can I serve in this church? Because if you serve in the church, you're vested in the church. And you're a part of it. You're part of the body of believers. This is probably the second most, the other three questions. It doesn't have the essentials of the Christian faith. Can I live with the secondary belief systems? And then can I serve? If you're in a church that can't serve, you can't function with your spiritual gifts. There was I asked a question once. You know, there's an estimate based on spiritual gift surveys that 80% of people in churches do not use their spiritual gifts for the kingdom. Now, I asked a doctor this, a physician, and I said, what would happen if 80% of the cells in your body stopped working? And he said, well, you'd have you'd have organ failure. The whole body would die. It's kind of like what were the churches today. We are living in a time where 80% of Christians, of members of the body of Christ, aren't using their spiritual gifts for the body of Christ. So the hand's not acting like the hand. The spleen's not acting like the spleen. The heart's not acting like the heart. The lungs are not acting like lungs. Everything has stopped working. This is one of the reasons why a church is in such crisis today. Is because the body of Christ is not serving the body of Christ. It's serving itself. Every cell is serving itself. And this is called cancer. It's not the body of Christ. Cancer consumes. It gives nothing back. So, as I said, the third and really important question is, how can I serve this church? If there's no way for you to serve the church, and some churches are organized that you can't serve in them, find another church. Because you won't be part of the church. You'll be cancer there. You need to be part of a church where you can be part of the body of Christ. As it says in Ephesians, the mysterion. The mystery of many parts but one body. So those are my tips for choosing a church. Look at the doctrinal statements. Make sure the essentials check out. Look at the secondary issues. Can you live with those additional doctrinal beliefs? You don't have to agree with them all, but you have to be able to live with them. And third, can you serve? If everything passes those tests, then you've got a church that is probably a good church, one that you can actually thrive and spiritually grow in. Keeps learning. Can women serve in leadership? It depends. It'll depend on the church. Some churches allow women in leadership, some don't. Again, is this a secondary issue you can live with? Do I think women can serve in leadership? Absolutely. I think women can serve in leadership. I have no problem with women serving in leadership. But again, that's going to depend upon which church you're talking about. There are some that are very strict about this. Am I comfortable in those churches? No, I'm not comfortable in those churches. Okay? But I'm also not going to denigrate those churches too for that. They have their reasons and they have their particular scriptural understanding of that. And I'm not going to get on my high horse here and, make a moralistic rules as saying, a church must always include women in leadership. Again, I'm understanding to the fact that all church traditions are not the same. But at that same point, too, I personally think that it's acceptable for women to be in leadership. Okay? So, anyway, I hope that answered your question on what's my advice for someone looking for a church. Again, I hope that you found that helpful. And again, those 3 questions. You can answer those 3 questions. You got yourself a potential church. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, and okay. Okay, we got here another one from Dafa Raffiali for 35,000. I forgot what that was.
IDR?
Yeah.
That is Indonesian.
A rupee. The rupee?
RUPI.
Rupiah. Okay. For 35,000 Indonesian rupiah. Well, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, so question below marked for the Q. So there it is. Okay. How fluid is the Old Testament text? Depends what you mean by fluid. The fluidity consists of what? Well, then it depends what you mean by fluid. How did they change or corrupt the text? Well, that's the billion-dollar question. Scholars said the Old Testament have fluid text. The proof is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I think that that's personally a misinterpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I know there's a lot of scholars today that do say, because we have a lot of variants of the text in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Old Testament texts are very fluid. And the fluid means that people could change them willy-nilly. That's what the scholars mean, is that changes could be arbitrary, and you had corruptions of the text, many intentional, and that ancient copyists didn't care to get the text right. Here's the problem I have with this, is that what we are dealing with is, by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have roughly 1,200 years of copying going on. But you look at, say, the New Testament texts, where you have 300,000 variants of the New Testament texts over the 2,000 years. You can't make the same argument. There's no question that the New Testament wasn't a fluid text, or that it was a fluid text. Almost every New Testament scholar is going to basically say that the New Testament texts weren't fluid. But there are many variants. A lot of this is just the effect of human beings copying things over and over and over again. Some are going to add a little bit here. Some are going to, you're going to have errors like homoteluton, where pieces of text are going to drop out. You're going to have mistakes. You're going to have emendations, corrections. People think, oh, well, that can't possibly be true, so I'll change it this way. That happens. I think the idea of these texts has never been that it's just they changed it on a whim. They were always trying to think through the text as they copied it. Sometimes to their detriment. They would change it one way, and then the next generation go, hey, wait, that's not right. So change it back. This is how we get the Katav and Kare. By the time the Masoretes get their hands on the text, and these are the Jewish scribes of the 8th through 10th centuries that are basically copying and filling in the vowel points in the consonantal text. And they're going to go, wait, now this is what the text is written, how it's written, but this is how it should read. And they know that they're thinking here that there's an error here in the text, but they're not confident enough to change the text. So they're going to say, okay, it's written this way, but it should be read this way. So that's how they're going to do it. But there's thousands of years of textual copying that happened before the Masoretes. And this is why we have so many variants of the Old Testament, is because of this sort of copying. Like, for example, we find in, say, the Samaritan Pentateuch, we find, say, the Israelites were in Egypt and Canaan, 430 years. Whereas in the Masoretic text, they reversed it, or the other way around. I don't remember which one. But one text has it Egypt and Canaan, and the other text has it Canaan and Egypt. So it's essentially the same contents, but they just got flipped. One of those texts got flipped during a copy. So it doesn't imply all these variant texts that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't necessarily indicate that the text was fluid, but it does indicate that there were a lot of copies. And if you get a lot of copies that are done by human beings, you're going to get a lot of variants. This is what we find with the New Testament, and I think it's reasonable a reasonable explanation for the amount of variations that we have in, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I would be very, very careful to use that term fluidity, because it's a loaded piece of language that does seem to suggest that people didn't care about the copy. I think the fact that they were making corrections all along the way and updates means they cared a lot about the copy and to get it right. They just didn't, because that's being human. You're going to make mistakes when you copy things. That's just human beings do this. Copy the same. I mean, I don't think there's any student in high school that wasn't given like 100 lines to write out as a punishment. By the time you get to 998, you're starting to make mistakes. The same thing copied over and over and over again. So, that just happens. Is the more you copy something, you're bound to have mistakes creep into the text. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Okay, we have the Camel Leopard 2 here for $10. It's good to see you here tonight. Glad you could join us. And he asked, yeah?
He sent you an email.
I already got it. Okay, so I'm going a little slow here because I don't want to miss Jack Ray. Because I already saw it. Thank you, Jack Ray. We'll get to yours in a moment here. The Camel Leopard says, Camel Leopard says, is Hasatan in the book of Job meant to be the devil or an anonymous angel within divine council who is acting as an accuser? What should be taken away if it is in fact the devil? All right. Now, the fact we're dealing with the book of Job, we're dealing with poetry. I don't think we can necessarily equate the Hasatan in the book of Job with the devil. Now, the devil is going to be equated with Hasatan in other places. And Hasatan is an adversary. That's what Hasatan means. It means adversary. Okay. So what we get from the book of Job is that there is a accuser. Okay. It might be the devil. That's a possibility. And now it's a possibility that we shouldn't immediately disregard. Because God in the book of Job asks the Hasatan, hey, where have you been? And the Hasatan says, oh, I've been to and fro over the earth. And this servant of yours, Job, has come to my attention. So, within the divine counsel that we see in the book of Job, the Hasatan is not a regular, constantly sitting member. He's sort of a member ad hoc. Given the fact that he's a member ad hoc, does raise suspicions that he could be the devil. What we mean by the devil here is the fallen cherubim in the Garden of Eden, the one that tempted Eve. Okay. But it's also true here that in the book of Job, Hasatan is a job title. It is one of the divine council who is tasked with the job of being an adversary against Job. Whether that has been by appointment by God, self-appointment, or by appointment by the divine council, we're not told. Okay? But the Hasatan here has taken it upon himself to be the adversary, to be the prosecutor against Job. So, what is to be taken away if it is in fact the devil? If it is in fact the devil, then what we take away from this is he has taken it upon himself to be the accuser of all mankind, not just Job. That this was his sort of role in the divine council, was to bring mankind down. If he's just a random prosecutorial spirit, then it is possible that he is part of the divine council did his job, and then returned to the divine council. My leaning on this is more that it is, again, more towards being the devil than it is, say, being just a random member of the divine council. I do think in this particular case that if it is the devil, though, he would be one of those, say, cherubim, one of those throne cherubim, as is identified in Ezekiel. And I think that it would be, he's different materially than, say, other members of the divine council. And the divine council is made up of various different types of spiritual entities. It's not just one spiritual entity. There's many types of spiritual entities on the divine council. Cherubim are and seraphim are just some members of that. There are other spirits as well. But that's sort of my take on it. I mean, we're not completely certain about this, so I don't want to make it seem like, hey, it's absolutely the devil. No, we're not sure about that. But I think the text is suggestive that this is a rogue spirit. This is not a spirit that's normally on the divine council. He's an ad hoc member. And because he is an ad hoc member, that he is probably the devil. So that's sort of where I kind of stand on that. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. This is Hasatan here is definitely a job function. It's not a name. And we don't actually get the name of the deity, the entity involved here. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. All right. Next question here is also from Camillapard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. If the Apocrypha weren't intended to be in Scripture, why were they included in the Septuagint? Because the Septuagint took a kitchen sink approach to Jewish scriptures. And it included everything they thought was worth including. It also included some pseudepigrapha. Okay? So the Septuagint had a lot of stuff in it, extra stuff. So it's one of the things we have to be a little careful about the Septuagint is it's not really a great standard of canonicity. What do you mean exactly?
They didn't want to leave anything.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So they'd rather include it.
Yeah. The whole translational philosophy of the Septuagint was to include as much in it as possible. Okay? The idea of the Septuagint was to take as broad a set of text as possible. This is why we have many of the longest, say, books, the longest editions of certain books. And they basically translated that so that nothing got excluded. So that's why I say the Septuagint took a kitchen sink approach. This is why we find, say, extended versions of, say, Daniel in the Septuagint. We find Ecclesiasticus in the Septuagint. It's a very long book. It's many times longer than Ecclesiastes. Septuagint took the longest manuscripts it could find and translated those. This is why it also included the Apocrypha and also some pseudepigrapha. Because it did take that, it didn't try to answer questions of canonicity. And I think to use the Septuagint to answer questions of canonicity is to ignore the translational philosophy of the Septuagint translators. And that translational philosophy is to include it all. As broadly, as many possible readings crammed in there as they can. This is also why we find many extended readings. Because the Septuagint is going to do that. It does it with, say, Deuteronomy 32, where it adds extra long readings in there. So I think this is what we have to. This is the takeaway from the Septuagint, is it's really going to be it's an exhaustive translation. It's the, how do I put this? It's the amplified translation for Greek. Okay? That's the amplified Greek Bible. Okay? Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's not as quite as ridiculous as the Amplified Bible. The Amplified Bible takes every definition of a word and just strings it out in its translation. But that's what the Septuagint, in a similar matter, is trying to take as many texts, cram them all in, and do a translation of every possible reading within a text. Okay, so it's trying to be thorough. It's trying to be comprehensive, but it is not trying to be canonical. So as long as you understand that the Septuagint is not trying to be canonical, take it for what it is. It's a good set of Greek translations of an exhaustive set of texts. And that is what Septuagint was trying to achieve. A good, exhaustive translation from the broadest possible text to serve a Greek community who might have various readings. So anyway, that's why they included the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and other books. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay, I think we're getting close to Jack right here. Nope, we got 123 sushi here first. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sushi for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. For Old Testament textual criticism, has Cochin Torah been studied? I'm not sure because I don't know off the top of my head what Cochin Torah is. So I'd have to probably look that up. And let me just see if I can do a quick look up that, because that one I'm not sure of. Ah, okay, Jews in India. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, most text critical work has not involved these sets of texts. Yeah, so this is after, looks like the community, because I'm learning this for the first time here. So it sounds like that community was set up after, say, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So I am not really sure about what their texts are and what Torah they're using. So I can't comment any more on that, but from what I know, most text critics have not used these texts. Okay. Commonly, Bryce Bell, I think my question was missed. If it was a super chat, we'll go back and find it. You see Bryce Bell? Bryce Bell. No, I don't see a Bryce Bell. Was it a super chat? If it was a regular question, we're going to go back and take a look anyway. So don't worry about that. Okay, we'll.
I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think we had a super chat from Bryce Bell. Okay, sorry about that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sushi. We just want to make sure we don't miss anybody. But yeah, as far as I know, nobody in that. I don't know what the texts are in that community, but I don't think anyone at the moment is using that Torah in text critical work. Now, text critical work can use a variety of, say, non-Hebrew sources. I mean, we use the Septuagint. We often use Aramaic Targum for text critical work. We even find something like occasionally Georgian texts, because of their antiquity, being used in text critical work. So it would not be uncommon for a text critic to use, say, a translation of a Torah or a New Testament text from a different language. That's pretty common. But I've not heard of this particular community's text being used. So, as far as I know, they have not been studied on the basis of text criticism. That's not to say that they can't be. In fact, if they got a really antiquated text, that could actually be an incredibly good opportunity for a text critic to basically, do some really innovative work. So I think if someone were to pick up this ball and find that they had a text that goes back to antiquity, that would be a great text critical opportunity to study. So as far as I know, no, it hasn't. But, at the same time, too, because it hasn't, that presents an opportunity as well. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Going through the onion ring stuff at the moment. Camel Leopard for $2. Okay. Thank you much for the super chat. Who created death? Death is the result of sin. This is what you find in Genesis 2 and 3, where essentially you have a proliferation of death. Now, we have to understand that the biblical definition of death is separation. Okay? When Adam and Eve eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they experience death. Now, they don't die immediately, but they are experiencing death all over the place. They're experiencing separation from God. They're experiencing separation from each other. There's now strife between man and woman. There's going to be separation with their offspring. They're not going to get along with their kids. They're experiencing separation from the environment. The earth is going to fight them for crops, and the earth is going to withhold its nutrition. There's going to be psychological separation. Mankind is going to be a tormented being. Soul and spirit are going to be at odds with each other. This is death. And, when the body itself finally dies, the spirit is going to be separated from the body. All that proliferation of death came about as a result of sin. So if you do it a who, it would be mankind. That's who invented death. That's who created death. It wasn't intended to be that way. But that's the result of mankind's choice. So it didn't have to be that way, but that was the inevitable result of the decisions that our forebears made. So that's who created it, and it's the result of our disobedience is separation. Separation of the, as I say, death is just a kind of separation. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and I hope that provided you an answer. Okay, we got another one here from Dafa Raffaelli for 35,000 Indonesia rupiah. Thank you very much for the super chat. Question below with a Q. Okay. In the Exodus story, why scholars reject 2 million Jews in Exodus and translate Eleph as clan, not 600,000 men, whereas tax that imposed the 20-year results equal around 600,000 men. Okay. Now, this is a very, very interesting set of texts here. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they reject the 2 million Jews. Israelites. They're really not Jews yet. They're Israelites in the Exodus. First of all, the 2 million is a theological interpretation. It basically, the text talks about 600,000 Gibor, which are basically heroes or fighting men. Now, the 600,000 fighting men is basically those aged 20 to 60. And that is, theologians then took that and said, oh, there had to be an equal number of women. Okay, so you got 1.2 million there. Plus another factor for those who are children and those over the age of 60. And from that, they extrapolate about 2 million. Okay? 2 to 3 million. Okay? But this would have been much, much more the entire population of Egypt. So that would have been resulted in one heck of an uprising if those were all, that was your slave population. Having a slave population many times larger than your native population, they could have just taken over. But there's other reasons too, which is it would have been a logistical nightmare to move people during the Exodus. The amount of food you would have needed would have been just, if you're trying to feed 2 million people every day, that's a lot of food. A lot of food. More than basically Egypt could produce. At least at the time. There also was the fact that the places where the Israelites lived in Egypt, archaeology has shown that the largest of those centers was probably around 50,000 people. So we're probably talking no more than roughly in the low 100,000s total. The other thing is too that we do have potentials for alternate translations. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Aleph being used in this way. I think, as I study this text more and more, I am more getting the impression here that what we're talking about is a genre of literature here, basically a military genre, where we're not talking about literal numbers. We're talking about, like, in one of the things we find in military genres in the ancient Near East is there is an inflated number, intentionally inflated. We don't know exactly why they did this for military, in the military genre, but they did. We see it all over the place in military genre. We see this in, say, the battles of Alexander the Great, where he's fighting 2 million Persians. At Thermopylae, they're fighting 2 million Persians. the numbers of Pharaoh's army are vastly inflated. There's in military annals, you do see the numbers of soldiers being inflated. We don't know why that is, but it does seem to be what's going on. So I think that's actually the genre consideration here is probably the best explanation I've heard of so far for why 600,000 Gibor, but not 2 million people. So, in that respect, then, when you're talking about here, say, the census, it's not trying to give you a exact number of people. What it's trying to give you here is an inflated sense of the number of fighting men. Again, inflated, we don't know why, but it is consistent with the genre. So I think that's probably the best explanation we have here. And the other thing is that the Becca, the tax imposed on 20-year-olds and up, we have to also remember that did not just apply to men. Applied to women too. Okay? So if you're going to use this argument to affirm the 600,000 Gabor, you've got to keep in mind that it's going to apply to women also. The Becca is a tax. It's a head tax that applied to any person 20-year-old and up. Men and women alike. And it applied regardless of age. That's the other thing too. Is this applies, the Becca is everybody from age 20 all the way up to your your great-great-grandma who's 105. Okay? She's got to pay it too. So, that's going to affect this. That's going to affect this. So, before you sort of say, okay, this is the proof of, say, the 2 million Jews or Israelites of the Exodus, you're going to have to seriously redo your counts if you're going to say that this is the 600,000 men, because there's no cutoff for the Becca. There's no cutoff. It applies to 80-year-olds, whereas that fighting force it has a cutoff. It's 20 to 60, and it applies only to men. So the two are not synonymous measures. They're not equal measures. They're different measures. If anything, the Becca is going to show that there's actually a lot less people going out to actually fight than is being recorded in, say, the census. So you're also going to have to keep in mind that in other places of the text too, it records certain things about the nation of Israel that does seem to indicate that there were a lot less than 2 million people. For example, there's a place in the book of Judges where it calls Israel the smallest of the 8 nations of Canaan. Well, Canaan was a very depopulated land at that point. So we are going to have to reconcile this with the fact that Israel is coming into the land of Canaan with less people than its neighbors.
And yet they were still...
Yes, but that's a miracle of God. So, anyway, I hope that answered the question. I think the best explanation for this is genre. That's what I think, honestly. I think the clan, translating that as clan, is problematic because you also have hundreds and fifties in there as well, and that's once you start doing that as clans, and maybe okay, you could do clans as Elif, you could do hundreds as maybe clades, but once you start getting into 50s, you're stretching it at that point. You're stretching that interpretation very, very thin at that point. I think a much better, as I say, a much better explanation of this is just genre. It's a military genre. They inflate the numbers in the military genres. We don't know why.
To scare the bad guys.
Well, scare the bad guys, yeah, sure. That's probably the best explanation, actually. So anyway, thank you very much.
Like an Old Testament scholar, first response is, yeah, to scare the bad guys. You say, we have 10,000 people instead of, yeah, it's 10 guys and grandpa.
Yeah, probably just to scare the bad guys. All right, so anyway, yeah, fail to do it. Makes you look impressive, yeah, probably. That's probably it right there. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay. Another one here from Dafa Raffaelli for 35,000 Indonesia rupiah. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he asks, is there corruption in the Septuagint? And again, what do you mean by corruption? Are there mistakes? Yes. Are there any Old Testament forgeries? We call those pseudepigrapha. Yes, there are Old Testament forgeries. Scholars said at least there are forgeries in Deuteronomy and Daniel. Do you agree? No, I do not agree. I do think there are multiple text sources in the Deuteronomy. I think, say, for example, the certain versions of the supplementary hypothesis are probably correct as far as Deuteronomy. Daniel, less so. I'm less convinced that this is true of Daniel. The reason why scholars will say this of Daniel is because of the prophecies. And the idea that, modern scholarship is not comfortable with the idea of prophecies that come true. So
makes it hard to be an atheist.
Yeah, it makes it hard to be an atheist when you have prophecies coming true. So yeah, I've got some issues there with I think there's much better ways to explain it other than say forgeries in Daniel. I mean, recontextualization is probably even a better explanation, to be honest, than forgeries, even if you were an atheist. So I don't think that's even a good explanation if you're an atheist. I think a much better explanation in the case of Daniel is just recontextualization. So even if you were to take a materialistic point of view, I think the idea of forgeries in Daniel is just the poorest explanation. As far as Deuteronomy goes, I don't think there's any problem with the idea that there were multiple sources to Deuteronomy that were, say, collected, supplemented over time to Deuteronomy. I don't have any problems with that. So, as far as are there any historical errors in the Old Testament? Well, there's copyist errors, but historical errors, not so much. At least I've not found many of them. There are some ones that are debatable, but there's also explanations for those as well. And if you have an explanation for them, then it's really, really difficult at that point to say that they are, at least with absolute certainty, that they are historical errors. So that's sort of my view on this, is I think that the Old Testament is largely historical. I think there's some that are, say, borderline cases. Basically, what do you mean by certain prophecies? I have seen some incredibly bad argumentation to, say, attack the historicity of the Old Testament, but I also don't think a lot of that argumentation holds well under sound scrutiny. So anyway, I hope that answered your questions. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay.
Oh, yeah, price bills.
I did not. I'm not even there yet. Still trying to work my way through here. I think I'm at the end, and then it all of a sudden scrolls up some more. I thought I had Jax earlier than this. Did I pass by Jax? Yeah, must have. All right, I need to find Jax. You have any idea where Jax is?
No, just
Fortunately, I can't. Let's see. Can I search? Probably not. Let's see if I can find it here.
mine only goes up to I'm a leopard. Most of it. This question in the email?
No, he didn't. At least I don't think he did. Check my email here. Just a second. I need to find Jack Ray's here. Maybe, but I just need to find it. No, it's not in my email. I know he made a contribution, so I need to find it. So let me start again, and I will. Here. Okay, gonna see your. All right, I'm just looking for Jack Ray's here because he gave us a very, very generous super chat. Okay, I see some Jack Ray here. Okay. Jack Ray says, please ask Dr. Falk to check his PayPal email for a super chat equivalent sponsoring a live chat. Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a very, very generous super chat. Very much appreciate that. Super chats like that really help us and keep it going. And he contributed $100. And thank you very much for that. It's very, very generous super chat. And we really, really appreciate that. Okay, so let's find sponsoring a live chat. Well, who are we going to sponsor? Who do we select? See if I can find a question here. I am looking for a non-super chat to sponsor here. I don't see any at the end, so I'm going to go to the beginning. I'm going to go back up to the top then. Okay. We tend to get more non-superchats at the beginning and at the end. So. All right. Let's see here. Acrolis. I have not. Let's see. I have not seen that. Let's see. I will take this. This won't be the sponsored one, but I want to answer this one quickly. Superjam asks, have you ever been exposed or examined the claims of the Kemetic community? Depends what you mean by Kemetic. There is a Kemetic Orthodox community, which is essentially a revivalist religion, Egyptian religion. And then there's what's called the conscious community, which is another kind of revivalist, more along the lines of African American version of, say, Egyptian religion. I have examined both claims. I've examined both communities, but they're very different. They're very different. So I've been asked to do a lot more on the conscious community, though, than, say, the Kemetic Orthodox community. So that's what I've examined. But that's not going to be our sponsored super chat. I just wanted to answer that one. So let's start taking on super chats anyway. So the next chat is going to be the one that gets sponsored by Jack Ray. But I'm going to find one here. Yeah, they're very chatty today. They're not so much questiony. Ooh, I don't want to touch that one, though. There's some spicy stuff in here. Well, somebody is asking me if I have a position on the documented Eucharistic miracles.
Oh, that one.
Yes. Actually, I will take that one.
The sponsored one.
That's this little sponsored one. We're going to do this one. Okay. Harry Stark asks, does David have a position on the documented Eucharistic miracles? I do actually have a position on the documented Eucharistic miracles, which is some are valid, some are not. Essentially, I'm going to take every sort of miracle on a case-by-case basis. But I also think that, say, Eucharistic miracles are an extension of, say, healing. The healing miracles that we do find in, say, the spiritual gifts given to the church. Do I think these miracles are exclusive to the Eucharist? No. No. I also think that some are very poorly documented. I wouldn't give them much credence, some of these. But at the same time, too, there are some that are probably legit. So, but as I say, I don't think this is something that's, say, exclusive to the Eucharist. There are people who have experienced miracles under a variety of various circumstances. So, again, my point of view on this is that sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. It's going to depend on what's being documented, what the miracle manifestation is, how it's being manifest, who are the witnesses, what's the evidence. And I'm a hardcore evidentialist. So for any miracle claim, I want to see some evidence. And this is not, this is not unusual anyway. This shouldn't be, a showstopper. Frankly, when the Vatican decides to canonize a saint, they look for evidence. They look for evidence of miracles. And what are the claims and the evidence for those miracles? They investigate those miracles on the basis of its evidence. So, if the Vatican is doing it for the canonization of saints, it's a legitimate practice to investigate the evidence for miracles. I don't think that's a problem. So when I do approach, say, the documentation of Eucharistic miracles, some I think are bona fide, some are not. So it's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. So that's my position on this, is sometimes. But again, not a lot of these miracles would be, I would say, not exclusive to the practice of the Eucharist. Many of the phenomena that we do see in Eucharistic miracles do manifest in other places. So that, I think, is also very telling. It's a general manifestation of the Christian church, not something that is specific to the Eucharist. The Eucharist can be a point of faith, a point of healing, basically where faith and practice intersect. Because if faith and practice are intersecting at the Eucharist, it can be a point where miracles can take place, and often do. But other intersections of faith and practice can also result in the appearance of miracles. So that's where that's my position on this, is when you do have that faith and practice intersecting, the chance of, say, a divine manifestation through a miracle is increased. So, with that said, thank you very much for that super chat. I want to thank Jack Ray for that super chat. He sponsored it, and this is the question that we selected for this. And I hope that provided a balanced answer to the supposed documented Eucharistic miracles. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on the evidence. And you're going to find this where faith and practice intersect. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, Jack Ray, and thank you, Harry Stark, for a great question. All right, now we're going to go into some non-super chats, and then we're going to call it a night. Okay, I did not see Bryce Bell's question.
He reposted it.
Okay. All right. How much did he contribute? Do you know?
I didn't.
Okay. Well, assuming that Bryce Bell has given a super chat here, we will definitely take his question. Okay, I see it. Okay. Okay. If we missed a super chat, I apologize for that. I did not see a super chat here, so let me find it here. Okay, I see it. All right. And he asks, "Hi, Dr. Falk. A good Christian friend of ours ascribes to the Jewish dietary laws, either out of legalism legalism obedience, or a way to get closer to God? What would you say to this? Part 2, of course, the New Testament speaks very much against maintaining of dietary laws. Okay. A lot of this is going to depend upon, I think, some cultural things. I know, for example, if you're Messianic Jewish, many Messianic Jews still follow the dietary laws. More out of a sense of obedience than legalism. Okay? And if you're doing this because you think it's healthy, when I was Messianic Jewish, I ate pork. Okay? I ate shrimp. My diet was so Western, it wasn't even funny. Bacon, bacon cheeseburgers were Carl's Jr. bacon, what's it called? The Western bacon cheeseburgers. The Carl's Jr. bacon Western cheeseburgers were my go-to burger. Okay. Okay, so I'm very, very poor example of say a Messianic Jew, but but at the same time too, I do know people in the Messianic Jewish movement who still follow the dietary laws because some of them were raised on this. Some of them were, say, Orthodox Jews or conservative Jews who converted to Messianic Judaism. And they just continued the diet that they had growing up. I know one who just couldn't stand the smell of bacon. Just couldn't stand the smell of it. So even though he knew he had the freedom to eat as he desired, he didn't want to. Just because he was raised, eating other things. I, on the other hand, was raised, completely Western diet, I lived in a port city. I eat seafood. It's just... So, on the other hand, though, too, there is that legalistic aspect that I think is pernicious. So, if you're doing it out of a sense of, say, culture, that's one thing. Okay, there's nothing wrong with having a diet that's based on culture. Every culture has its diet. Some will kill you like the standard American diet, but other cultures have their particular diets too. And there's nothing wrong with a culture having its own diet. And the Jewish culture does have its own diet. And if you're doing it for cultural reasons, I can respect that. If you're doing it for legalistic reasons, you're saying, for me to be right with God, I have to eat this diet. That's legalism. That's legalism. Because the dietary law is part of the sacrificial system. It's part of the ritual law. And the ritual law has been completely covered by the atoning blood of Jesus Christ. So to say you need to do the ritual law to be right with God is to sacrifice Christ again. Basically put his sacrifice to open shame. So there is that legalistic side of things of the dietary law that's definitely not good. It compromises the gospel of grace. And when it starts getting into matters of legalism here, it's often, hey, you're not right with God because you're not following every jot and tittle of the law. Well, that law cannot be completely adhered to. It's too vast. The bar's too high. No man can keep the law perfectly. You're going to break some ordinance of the law. I think this is the danger of legalism. It really is the danger of legalism. So, it's going to depend upon the reasons why they're adhering to the law. If they're doing it, as I said, out of a sense of culture, no problem. You know, if this is their cultural diet, not an issue with that. If they're doing it out of a legalism, there's an issue there. So, that spiritual issue has to be engaged if it is done out of a sense of legalism. Because we are right through the finished work of Jesus Christ. By grace through faith, not of works. And legalism is definitely works. So, with that said, I think that sort of covers the scope here of the problem. Thank you very much for that super chat. I don't know how much. I'm going to take that. Bacon is evidence of God and proof that he loves us. Absolutely. He also says, I used to work on the grill for Carl's Jr. as a teenager. Man, I got so sick of those burgers. Oh, but if you don't work on the grill, I mean, look, I can understand if you work there, you got sick of them. But man, those were some of the best tasting burgers I've ever had at any food chain. Oh. Oh yeah, I loved Carl's Jr. I mean, I thought they were the best tasting burgers. Especially that Western bacon cheeseburger with the crisp cut fries and the ranch dressing. Oh, so good. Yeah, we get them. We there's one in downtown on Denman. We get burgers from them occasionally when I'm downtown. Not down. I don't go to downtown very often, but there is one Carl's Jr. here in Vancouver. One. This is the hungry stream.
It's Faye's fault for asking about it.
Jack Ray says, I'm glad there's no Carl's Jr. near where I live. I'm so tempted now. Oh, it was so good. Oh boy. Yeah, you know, Hardee's was good, but it wasn't as good as Carl's.
After they split.
Yeah, that was after they split. The two chains split. It wasn't quite the same. It's not quite the same. The burgers at Carl's are just that much better. And yeah, they're not the same. They're not the same. I mean, look. I mean, we've had Hardee's. I mean, when we moved to the Midwest, we were kind of had we developed separation anxiety from Carl's Jr. Because there was these Hardee's, and it was like Carl's Jr. It had the same decor as Carl's Jr., but the burgers weren't quite right. They're not quite the same.
Yeah,
and
they have slightly different pedigrees.
Yeah, they do have slightly different pedigrees. The Western bacon cheeseburger you could not get at Hardee's. You also could not get the habanero burger, which is almost as good. I mean, the habanero is very, very good. So yes. But I'll tell you one thing Hardee's was better with than Carl's was its desserts. One thing you could get at Hardee's that you could not get at Carl's Jr. was a deep fried apple pie. That was really good at Hardee's. That was better at Hardee's than the desserts that you get at Carl's Jr. Carl's Jr. did not make good desserts. But Hardee's made actually better desserts than Carl's. But the burgers were better at Carl's. By far.
I agree. Change the subject. Have a bottle of water.
Oh boy. Oh yeah, I love those apple pies, says 1000 clever boy. Y'all making me hungry. Yeah. Five Guys is fair. I didn't think so. We've had Five Guys. We have a Five Guys here. No, not for me. It's okay, but it's. I mean, the big bag of fries. Yeah, I'm not that. Yeah, I would agree with Jack Ray here. I don't like Five Guys. It's subpar.
Okay, back to serious questions.
Back to serious questions.
Well, Butler liked Acropolis' question, and I did too. He's like midway up.
He's midway up. Okay.
It's just a question, regular question, not a super chat.
That's fine. We're at the point where we're taking non-super chats at this point. So
it was a good question.
And if I can find it, all right.
What is considered the earliest chronological time mentioned in the Old Testament that can be confirmed? Not when the book was written, mentioned in it.
What is the earliest chronological time mentioned in the Old Testament that can be confirmed? Not when the book was written, but mentioned. Oh, that's a debatable question. Here's the thing. When we talk about confirmation of a chronological event, what do we mean by confirmation? Was it a real event? Did it? Can we confirm the date? That's a huge problem right there. Massive problem. So a lot of this is going to depend upon what we mean by confirmed. Yes, that is academic doublespeak. But I think it's a very important how we define this is going to depend how we frame the question. So are we, as I say, are we going to be talking about that could be confirmed historically? Can we confirm it by a date? Those are two separate questions, and they're different. Dating some of these events is a lot more difficult than confirming they actually happened. We do have certain things that happened in the Bible that we can confirm happened, but not necessarily date easily. I think in some respects, the earliest event that we can confirm happened goes back to one of our previous questions, which is on Terah. The sojourn of Terah is probably the earliest event that we can confirm. And that's by the Mari letters. Okay? That's the Mari letters. And it dates to the early 18th century BC. So that's probably the earliest event that we can confirm that happened. Okay? Now, confirmed dating, is going to be a problem because you're going to have to wait until the 7th century BC to confirm that, those events. Because the earliest event that we can actually confirm historically with a date is the death of Taharka. I believe that was in, if my memory serves me right, 664 BC. But after, and I could be wrong on that date, but that's what comes to mind. But the next date that we find in the Bible that's confirmed by date and by event is the march of Necho II up through Canaan to join his ally Ashurbanipal II to help the Assyrians fight in 609 BC. 610, 609 BC. This is when the Egyptian army marches through Canaan and is encountered. Josiah's army tries to stop Egypt's army from reaching Assyria, the Assyrians, and Josiah gets killed in the process. Just the death of Josiah takes place in 609, 610 BC, and that's a hard date. That's pretty much a hard date. So that one is chronologically confirmed as well as, say, an event that's confirmed. Now, we do have other events that happened previously to that we can confirm that happened, but, the dates on that get a little more slippery. So, a lot of this question is just going to boil down to what we mean by confirm. The earliest chronological time we can confirm, and that's really what we're going to mean by what we mean by chronological time and confirmed. That's going to color this question a lot. So that's what we can sort of piece together here, without getting, unless we define our terms more specifically. So anyway, I hope that helped. I know that's a bit of a vague answer, but it's also the best we have as well. But again, there's lots of events in the Bible between those two, say the sojourn of Terah and, say, the death of Josiah, that can be confirmed to have happened. Another example of this is the attack of Jehoram of the kingdom of Israel against King Mesha, and that's recorded in the Moabite stone. So we know that that battle took place because we actually have a secular source, an extra biblical source that confirms that it happened. We don't have a date, though. We got a rough date, but there's going to be some wiggle room there. So anyway, I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the question. It is a good question, but again, it's going to come down to how we define our terms on this one. And sometimes questions are like that, where we have to define our terms more closely to get a better answer. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. Okay, it's almost midnight. I'm going to take a couple more questions and then call it a night. Okay, so yes. Is there any extra biblical evidence of Hoshea, the last king of Israel? I would have to look that up. I think it was. I don't think we have a lot of extra biblical evidence of Hoshea. Just double check my chronology here. I don't think we have any extra biblical evidence of him. Yeah, this is the Northern Kingdom of Israel, 622. I wonder if it is in, say, the Shalmaneser, the records of Shalmaneser. I think it's the fifth or third. Double check that. Shalmaneser the fifth. Shalmaneser the fifth. Yeah, so I don't know if we have video froze. Okay. We have it back. We got a disconnect here. Okay, we back. We just got a temporary disconnect. Okay. Yeah, that happened on our end. OBS disconnected to the stream, but OBS is good. It reconnected. So the long and short is, I'm not sure if we have any records, any extra biblical evidence for Hoshea. So I'd have to look that up. So anyway, thank you very much for the question, and I just don't know. All right. So let's go see if we got any other non-super chats here, and we'll take, as I say, a couple more, and then we're going to call it a night because we're at midnight, and I got to go to work tomorrow. So okay, yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay. Patui Sumitas says, go to Ben Stanhope's master's thesis, page 31, for the Abdi minister of Hoshea Bulla. Okay, that'd be very interesting. So, again, I'd have to look that one up, but if we got a Bulla for him, that would be fantastic. Okay, so let's go up here and go up that way. Let's say we're only going to take maybe one or two more questions, and that's it. So these are probably going to be really, really short ones. All right, here's an interesting one. I'm going to take this one from Bonbon. Is there any significance to the color of different Shabtis during the 30-day period? I noticed some of them have kind of a cyan color, while others are a deep blue. Okay, what we're talking about here with the difference between cyan and deep blue is what's called faience. Now, faience is a very, very special kind of clay. It's self-glazing. We have the use of faience in Egypt going all the way back to the 3rd dynasty. The Egyptians loved faience. Faience is beautiful stuff. I actually have, and it comes in a variety of colors. I actually have here a little scarab, which is actually made of faience. Now, it's a brown faience, but faience comes in a large variety of colors. The Egyptians adored blue faience because it looked a lot like turquoise and lapis. Okay, so they adored this stone. Now, that said, they didn't ascribe any particular meaning to the color of faience. They just loved it. They absolutely adored it. It was considered, as I said, a substitute for turquoise and lapis. Now, we do find Shabtis in a variety of colors. You know, we do find them, as I said, made of blue faience. We find them, well, as you said, the more the cyan color and the dark blue. We also find plain white ones too. So there's plain white Shabtis as well. We also find some Shabtis that are just made of ordinary clay. So not made of faience at all. That are painted afterwards. So they're made of ordinary clay and just simply painted. So there's a huge variety of different Shabtis. And if you go to any sort of major Egyptological museum like the British Museum, or even there's one in Amsterdam that's actually has a huge Shabti collection, you can just see all sorts of different kinds of Shabti figurines. And they're all across the board in different shapes, colors, sizes, and there doesn't seem to be any particular significance to them, other than that some are of higher quality than others. Like, for example, if you see a Shabti from a royal tomb, they're gorgeous. They're beautiful, even if they're not decorated with color. I saw there's one in the British Museum, I think, from the tomb of Tutmosis IV, that is just white, and it's stunning. It's got beautiful color. It was made of stone. Gorgeous Shabti, absolutely gorgeous Shabti. No color on it at all, though. So there's a lot there that I think. I mean, you do get some Shabtis that have writing on them, saying that, "Hey, I am a Shabti," Okay, but there's no significance to the color itself. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. I'm going to take one more, and then we're going to call this a night. And I might end up taking another Bonbon one because I think we are out of questions. So I already took BC's one, which is whether the pyramids covered in plaster. The answer was no. Ah. Okay. I think this last one, this will be probably our last question for the night. Unless I see one here quickly from someone else. All right, I'll take that one then. Find it again. Okay, take this one here. This will be our last non-super chat for the night. And it's from Bonbon. And it's our last non-super chat for the night. How did ancient Egyptians deal with overcrowding and overpopulation in their cities, as well as transport congestion, particularly in the waterways for goods? Okay. Now, this is going to sound a little awful, but this is sort of how they dealt with overcrowding and overpopulation, which is starvation. Really. That's how overcrowding and overpopulation in Egypt sort of got handled. There wasn't really overpopulation in cities. Okay. Most of the population of Egypt was pretty distributed into, say, farming communities. So there weren't these massive cities in Egypt. There were some, like the capital city was usually a lot more crowded than other cities. But usually if you had to be of a certain class to live in those big cities to begin with. So if you were of that certain, let's say, noble class, like for example, if you lived in the capital city, chances are you were a scribe, an administrator, a priest, a soldier. You had occupation. You were well paid. You could afford to live in a city. If you were a farmer, you didn't live in a city. You lived out on your plot of land. If you were a nobleman, you probably also were living on a plot of land. Because that was always the ideal, for a noble person to live on a plot of land. So you didn't get a lot of overcrowding in the cities because the amount of people that were needed to operate the city was sort of kept at an optimal level. If people had, say, entered into the city to try to find, say, a better life, well, first of all, there wasn't freedom of movement between places anyway in Egypt. So if you were in a farming community, you couldn't just decide to move to a city. That wasn't permitted. You had to stay in that city. And this was true even of high ranks. Like, if you were the hereditary governor of a province in Egypt, you couldn't just pick up and move to a new province. You were stuck. Everybody in Egypt was sort of stuck where they lived. There was even times when, say, in some towns, that there were guards that prevented you from leaving. Yeah, armed guards. Like, for example, if you grew up in a craftsman village, you couldn't just leave. There was armed guards there that prevented you from leaving.
You were a resource of the king.
You were a resource of the king. Okay? So, this really did work to prevent overcrowding and overpopulation. As far as transport congestion, there were lots of waterways into Egypt, all through Egypt. So you didn't have large amounts of transport. Now, there was a vigorous trade that moved goods up and down the Nile, especially from the Delta and between the Delta and, say, Upper Egypt. So there was actually a lot of transports going through. There were a lot of canals. There was the occasional transport congestion, but and when that did happen, it did happen on the waterways, not in the towns, because they didn't have wheels, not until the Second Intermediate Period, so there wasn't any carts to basically have congestion. But of course, once the cart got introduced to Egypt, then you had some of that, say, donkey cart congestion.
Especially donkeys are
But you didn't get that until the New Kingdom, really. That's when you started seeing that sort of congestion. Okay?
Well, BC hasn't everyone become owned by the
Okay, we'll take that one as our last one, because that's actually a really, really good question. Okay, but we'll just finish up this one. So, a lot of overcrowding and overpopulation was handled by death, essentially. Plague, starvation, and because everyone was living on knife-edge agriculture, starvation claimed a lot of people very, very fast. People would start dying of starvation within 2 weeks of the crop failure. Just because they were on as I say, knife edge, like 50 calories from starvation at all times. We even see, including the rich, we even see, say, nobility had it, like 35% of mummies, which is your upper classes, show evidence of chronic malnutrition. So this is not something that just happened to commoners, it happened to the elites as well. So famine, disease, did its number on the population. This is one of the reasons why, say, Egyptian population vacillates so much. And it does vacillate a lot. And that's because of the incidents of plagues that hit Egypt over and over and over and over again. And famines. We can't forget the famines. Because every time there's a drought, there's a famine. So, anyway, I hope that answered the question. Thank you very much for the question. And Going to take one more question, and then we are going to call it a night. And that's going to be BC's question. He asks it at the very end here. Okay, and this is going to be our last non-super chat of the night. Which is, did everyone become owned by the king after he bought them with Joseph's grain? That is an interesting question. It became... What happened seems to have happened, and there is some textual evidence for this, that when the famine occurred, that the Hyksos government in the 15th dynasty, this is the dynasty that would have been Joseph's dynasty, they bought all the land. All the land. Given that, it's also probably clear that they also had vassalage over all the people. Okay? So, owned by the king is kind of a broad statement here. It doesn't seem to have been that they were owned as slaves, but more that they now owed the king taxation. And the Hyksos weren't so much slave keepers. They didn't care. Yeah, they used corvée labor. That was a kind of a taxation. Every king in Egypt and the ancient Near East had a kind of corvée labor system. Again, that's something we do normally find in the ancient Near East. However, it doesn't seem that the Hyksos enslaved anyone. It just doesn't. It wasn't their thing to enslave people. They were interested in money. They were interested in goods from Egypt that they could trade across the Mediterranean. Such that when Ahmose conquers Avaris, he finds ships at Avaris that are heavily, heavily laden with loot. All sorts of kinds of loot. Essentially, the Hyksos looted Egypt to trade it with other people in the Mediterranean, essentially to get more money. The Hyksos were interested in money. They weren't interested in slaves. So, in getting the vassalage of the people of Egypt, the Hyksos were essentially ensuring that they could tax them. And heavily tax them they did. This is one of the reasons why the 18th, 17th dynasty goes to war against the Hyksos. Is because the taxation, the burden of taxation is so high that the kings of the Theban dynasty say, enough's enough. You know, it's going to be this, we either fight them or this taxation's going to kill us. So, the Hyksos kings didn't own the people, but they had vassalage. And that vassalage gave them the right to tax. And tax heavily they did. So, even though the people said, hey, you know, own us, Hyksos says, we'll just tax you. You'll wish we owned you. Death and taxes. Death and taxes. Yes, well. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that. Great question. It's a great question to end on because it does put into perspective what the Hyksos did and why it elicited such a reaction it did from, say, the Theban dynasty. So that's going to be our final question for the night. We don't have any more super chats, so I think we're done. Anyway, I want to thank everyone here who joined us tonight. It was great to have you here tonight. We had a lot of great questions. I'm going to again say that we are right now working on both a Mana Machine alert and a popcorn review, and those should be coming up shortly. So stay tuned for that in the upcoming weeks. I want to thank everyone who gave us super chat tonight. Your super chats really, really help us, keep food on the table, the lights on, the internet connected. So we very, very much appreciate all the support we get from our super chat supporters. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters who without, getting as nearly as much rewards as they should, support keeping our equipment running and operating. We can't do it without the Patreon supporters, and we really appreciate their thankless support. They don't get nearly enough thanks. We also want to thank our regular subscribers who tune into us, who clicked on that subscribe button and the notification bell to get all our content. We also want to thank those who leave comments and likes, because that feeds the algorithm. So with that said, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It was a great night, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.